Chapter 1. The Storm Between Worlds. The western seas of Morindland boiled beneath a dying sky. Rain lashed across the black waters in endless sheets while thunder rolled through the heavens like the wrath of angry gods. Jagged cliffs rose from the coastline like broken teeth, crowned by ancient stone circles older than memory. Belgariad hated the place already. The newly crowned king of RWBY rode at the head of the small company, his cloak snapping violently in the storm winds. The orb of Aldor rested at his side, wrapped carefully in blue cloth, though even hidden away its light pulsed faintly through the fabric. Across his back rested the sword of the Revan king. The weight of both still felt unreal. Only weeks ago he had been Garion. Now he was preparing to march against Torak himself. "I still think this is a terrible idea," Silk announced from atop his horse. Prince Keldar of Drasnia pulled his hood lower against the rain while glaring suspiciously at the cliffs ahead. "You say that about everything," Garion replied. "No, sometimes I merely think things are unpleasant. This is catastrophic." Belgarath rode several paces ahead of them, hunched beneath his patched cloak. "Stop whining," the old sorcerer growled. "You dragged me into this," Silk reminded him. "Yes, and I regret it daily." Despite the familiar banter, Garion could sense the tension in his grandfather. Belgarath was worried. That alone was enough to unsettle him. The old man slowed his horse near the crest of a rocky rise overlooking the coast. Below them, firelight flickered among the ruins. Dozens of figures moved between towering stone pillars. None wore the markings of Mara. None carried the madness of Morind mystics. These men had abandoned the gods entirely, and that made them worse. "They're still here," Belgarath muttered darkly. Garion frowned. "Who exactly are they?" Belgarath spat into the mud. "Fools. That narrows it down wonderfully," Silk said. The old sorcerer ignored him. "Years ago, a handful of Morind magicians started digging into things no sane man touches. Demon worship, blood rites, summoning rituals." His expression darkened. "They stopped serving the gods long ago. Now they serve whatever answers them from the dark." Garion felt cold despite the storm. "Demons are real?" Belgarath shot him a look. "Garion, after everything you've seen, why would that surprise you? I was hoping there were limits. There aren't." Below them the chanting rose louder. The language was harsh and jagged, nothing like any tongue Garion recognized. The very sound of it hurt his ears. Several robed figures stood inside a massive circle carved into the stone cliffs. Crimson fire burned within the symbols. Garion suddenly realized the markings were moving, not glowing, moving, like living things. Silk quietly drew one of his knives. "I don't suppose we can simply leave." "No," Belgarath said. "Pity." One of the cultists suddenly looked upward. Even at this distance, Garion could see the man's eyes, solid black. The cultist screamed something. The entire circle erupted into motion. Green fire blasted upward from the cliffs. Belgarath reacted instantly.
"Down!"
Garion threw himself from the saddle as sorcery exploded overhead. The top of the ridge vanished. Stone and dirt rained through the storm. Silk hit the ground beside Garion. "I hate being right." More spells screamed toward them. Dark lightning, flaming skulls, shadows that moved with unnatural hunger. Belgarath thrust out one hand. "Be still." The word cracked across the coastline. Reality shuddered. Half the incoming attacks detonated instantly. The remaining spells struck an invisible barrier surrounding the three companions. The impact nearly knocked Garion flat. The cultists below shrieked louder. Their chanting became frenzied. Garion could feel something gathering beneath the cliffs, something ancient, something hungry. Then he saw it, a shape emerging within the crimson circle, not fully formed, just glimpses. Claws, burning eyes, a mouth far too large, the air itself warped around the thing. Belgarath's expression hardened. "Idiots," he snarled. "What are they summoning?" Garion demanded. "Something they can't control." One of the cultists lifted a curved dagger and slit his own throat. Blood splashed across the runes, the circle blazed brighter. The creature beyond the opening roared. Garion felt the sound inside his bones. Then the orb suddenly flared at his side. Pure blue fire burst through the cloth wrapping. The demon answered. A pulse of crimson power erupted from the ritual circle. The two forces collided. The world screamed. Lightning exploded across the heavens. The sea itself rose in towering walls around the cliffs. Several cultists disintegrated instantly. Others continued chanting even while their flesh burned away. "Grandfather!" Garion shouted. Belgarath's eyes widened. They're tearing open the boundary between worlds. Can they do that? They shouldn't be able to. The crimson circle suddenly expanded. But it was no longer merely a gateway. It had become a wound. Garion stared into impossible darkness beyond it. Not empty darkness, living darkness. And somewhere far away another power answered. Different from the demon, different from the orb. Alien, Garion saw flashes, a broken moon hanging over strange kingdoms, young warriors wielding impossible weapons, creatures made from shadow and hatred, a city shining like crystal, and 4 girls standing against monsters beneath falling snow. The vision vanished. The portal roared wider. Belgarath raised both hands. Garion, seal it with the orb. Garion reached for the jewel. Power surged through him, immense, terrifying. The orb blazed like a newborn star, but the demon struck back. A colossal claw burst partially through the portal. Reality fractured around it. Belgarath shouted the word again. The claw shattered, but the damage was already done. The portal collapsed inward, then exploded outward. The force hit Garion like a mountain. He saw Silk vanish into blinding light. Belgarath was screaming commands in the ancient tongue. The storm disappeared. The sea disappeared. Everything disappeared. Garion fell through chaos. Colors beyond imagination twisted around him. Voices echoed from impossible distances, some human, others monstrously inhuman. For one horrifying moment, Garion even felt Torak searching across the void for him. Then, even that vanished. The fall ended violently. Garion slammed into hard ground. Pain exploded through his body. For several moments he could only gasp for breath. Then he looked upward. The moon was broken, not eclipsed, broken. Huge fragments hung suspended across the night sky. Garion slowly sat up. Nearby Silk groaned. "If we're dead," the Drasnian muttered weakly, "I intend to complain to someone important." Several yards away, Belgarath climbed stiffly to his feet. The old sorcerer stared upward at the shattered moon with an expression Garion had never seen before. Unease. "This isn't our world," Belgarath said quietly. Silver-barked trees surrounded them. Crimson leaves drifted through cold night air. The forest felt wrong somehow, not evil, but dangerous. The orb pulsed uneasily against Garion's side. "Can you feel that?" he asked. Belgarath nodded slowly. "The power here is different." Before Garion could respond, the forest growled. All 3 men froze. Something moved between the trees. Then another. Red eyes opened in the darkness. Dozens of them. Silk immediately pulled knives into both hands. "Please tell me those are ordinary wolves." Belgarath stared into the shadows. For perhaps the first time in centuries, the ancient sorcerer truly looked uncertain. "No," he said softly. The creatures emerged. Massive black beasts crept from the darkness with bone-white masks covering their faces. Their crimson eyes burned with unnatural hatred. Shadows clung to their bodies like smoke. Garion instinctively reached for the sword of the Revan King. One of the creatures opened its jaws. A terrible screech shattered the forest silence. Silk blinked slowly. "I officially hate this world." The monsters charged, and beneath the broken moon of Remnant, the Child of Light drew the sword of the Revan King for the first time in another universe. Chapter 2. Strangers beneath the broken moon. The creatures came fast, far faster than wolves had any right to move. Garion barely had time to draw the sword of the Revan King before the first beast lunged from the darkness. Its crimson eyes burned with pure hatred. The creature's claws slammed against Garion's blade in a spray of sparks. The impact nearly tore the sword from his hands. "By Belar's beard," he shouted. The beast screeched again. Up close, it looked even worse. Its body resembled a wolf, only in the vaguest sense. Black fur shifted like living shadow across muscle and bone, while the white mask covering its face seemed fused directly to flesh. And there was intelligence in those eyes, not animal cunning, malice. Garion reacted instinctively. The sword flashed. Blue light erupted along the ancient blade. The creature exploded apart, not blood, not flesh. It simply dissolved into black smoke. Garion stared. What in the seven hells was that? "Move first, ask questions later," Silk snapped. The Drasnian ducked beneath another lunging beast and buried a knife into its eye. The creature shrieked. Belgarath thrust out one hand. "Be silent." The words struck like thunder. 3 of the monsters were hurled backward through the trees, hard enough to splinter trunks. But more kept coming. The forest had become a sea of glowing red eyes. Garion felt his stomach tighten. "There are too many." "Yes," Belgarath agreed irritably. "I'm aware of that." A larger creature crashed through the trees. This one towered above the others. Its massive black body resembled a bear covered in bone armor, and its roar shook the entire clearing. Silk looked horrified. "Why is there a larger one?" The monstrous beast charged. Belgarath cursed. Garion reached for the orb. Power surged through him. The blue jewel blazed like a miniature sun. The bear-like creature slammed into an invisible wall and staggered backward with a furious roar. Garion could feel the orb reacting violently. Not fear, anger, as if the very existence of these creatures offended it. Belgarath noticed immediately. "Interesting," the old sorcerer muttered. "This world has its own darkness." The monstrous Grim attacked again. Garion met it head-on. The sword of the Raven King cut through bone mask and shadow flesh alike. Blue fire erupted from the wound. The creature disintegrated into smoke. The smaller beasts hesitated, only for a moment. Then the entire pack charged at once. "Run!" Belgarath barked. They broke through the forest at full speed. Garion could hear the Grim crashing after them through the trees. More screams echoed in the darkness beyond, more creatures joining the hunt. The forest itself seemed alive with monsters. Hours appeared to pass, though it could not have been more than minutes. Again and again the Grim attacked, wolf-like creatures, winged horrors swooping through the night sky, long serpent-like things slithering through the underbrush. Each battle taught Garion something terrifying. These creatures did not fear death. They did not retreat. They hated, purely, absolutely. The farther they ran, the more the forest began to thin. Then Garion saw lights ahead. A city, massive stone walls rose beneath the broken moon. Watchtowers lined the battlements, while enormous spotlights swept across the wilderness outside. Silk gasped. "Now that is civilized." A shriek echoed overhead. Garion looked upward. Dozens of flying Grim descended from the clouds, perhaps not civilized enough. Silk amended. The walls erupted with light. Explosions thundered across the sky. Garion stopped in shock. The defenders atop the walls wielded strange staffs and weapons, unlike anything he had ever seen. Thunderbursts ripped through the air. Several flying Grim exploded apart instantly. "What are those?" Garion demanded. Belgarath narrowed his eyes. "Weapons, strange ones." Another wave of Grim burst from the tree line behind them. A horn sounded from the city walls. Searchlights swung toward the 3 companions. Then someone atop the wall shouted. The gates began opening. "Well," Silk said breathlessly, while sprinting toward safety. "That's encouraging." The Grim reached them just short of the gates. Chaos erupted. Armored soldiers poured outward, wielding bizarre mechanical weapons that spat fire and thunder. Garion stared as one woman swung a massive hammer that transformed mid-motion into some kind of cannon. The blast obliterated 2 Grim instantly. "I don't even want to know how that works," Silk declared. Garion cut down another beast beside the soldiers. Several huntsmen and guards glanced toward the glowing blue sword in his hand, but none appeared particularly surprised by the weapon itself. In a world where warriors carried transforming scythes, gunblades, and war hammers that fired explosives, a glowing sword barely earned a second glance. What drew attention instead was how Garion fought, the speed, the precision, and the strange blue energy that seemed to erase Grim completely. One young huntress blinked as Garion cleaved through a charging Grim with a single strike. "Okay," she muttered. "That is definitely not dust." Inside the walls, another guard shouted. The gates slammed shut behind them with a deafening boom. Outside, Grim continued hurling themselves against the defenses. Garion leaned against the stone wall, trying to catch his breath. The city beyond was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Towering buildings of steel and glass stretched upward into the night. Strange, glowing lights illuminated wide streets. Machines roared through the roads faster than galloping horses. Silk slowly turned in a circle. "Either we've gone mad," he announced, "or civilization became very strange while we weren't looking." Belgarath looked disturbed. That worried Garion more than the Grim had. The old sorcerer studied the city carefully. "Come on," he muttered. "We need information." They quickly discovered that information would not come easily. Everyone spoke a language none of them recognized. The words sounded vaguely familiar in rhythm, but utterly incomprehensible. Garion frowned as a nearby merchant attempted to give them directions. "This could be a problem." "Only briefly," Belgarath replied. The old man led them into a narrow alley between two buildings. "Hold still," Garion felt the familiar sensation of sorcery gathering. Belgarath closed his eyes. "This world has language rooted differently than ours," he murmured. "That complicates things." "Can you still do it?" Silk asked. Belgarath gave him an annoyed look. "Of course I can still do it." The old sorcerer placed one hand against the wall. "Now!" The word echoed softly. Power rippled outward. Garion suddenly felt something shift inside his mind. Foreign sounds, meanings, patterns, knowledge flooded through him so quickly, it nearly staggered him. Then it settled. Belgarath opened his eyes. There, a pair of nearby civilians glanced toward them. "You three okay?" one asked. Garion blinked. Now he understood perfectly. Silk grinned. "Useful trick. Don't abuse it," Belgarath warned. They eventually found an inn near the center of the city. The building was warm, crowded, and loud with conversation. Unlike their arrival at the gates, almost no one paid attention to Garion's sword or Silk's knives. Weapons were everywhere. Rifles leaned beside tables, massive swords rested against walls. One woman casually carried a spear nearly twice her height while eating dinner. Garion stared openly. "Nobody cares about weapons here?" Silk followed his gaze. "I think everyone here is armed." That realization alone told them volumes about the world. Silk, meanwhile, appeared entirely comfortable. At last, the Drasnian sighed while dropping into a chair. "Civilization." A serving girl approached with an easy smile. "You three aren't from around Vale, are you?" Silk smiled easily. "What gave us away?" "The accents, mostly," she replied. Garion looked around carefully. The conversations around them slowly began revealing pieces of this strange world. Vale, Beacon Academy, Huntsman, Dust, Grim. None of it made complete sense yet, but one thing became abundantly clear. This world lived under constant siege from the creatures outside its walls. Belgarath sat silently listening. His expression grew more troubled with every passing minute. Miles away atop a cliff overlooking Vale, another man suddenly looked up from his desk. Professor Ozpin of Beacon Academy slowly set down his coffee cup. The air itself had changed. He could feel it. Something ancient had entered Remnant, not grim, not magic as he understood it. Something older, far older. The headmaster's eyes narrowed. A faint pulse of impossible power echoed across the kingdom. Ozpin quietly rose from his chair and stepped toward the window overlooking the sleeping city. "Interesting," he murmured. Behind him, Glinda Goodwitch entered the office. "You called for me?" Ozpin continued, staring toward Vale. "We have visitors," he said softly. Glinda frowned. "Visitors, 3 of them, and unless I miss my guess, they are not from this world." That immediately got her attention. "Impossible." Ozpin gave a faint smile. "Yes, which is why I would like you to investigate before the situation becomes complicated." Glinda adjusted her glasses. "Do we know anything about them?" Ozpin was silent for several moments. Then he spoke carefully. "One carries power unlike anything I have ever felt before." He paused. "And another feels old enough to remember kingdoms long before Vale existed." For perhaps the first time in years, genuine concern crossed Glinda Goodwitch's face. "I'll leave immediately." Far below Beacon Academy, in a crowded inn filled with strangers, Belgariad suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. Someone was searching for them. Chapter 3: Questions and Curiosity. The inn had quieted somewhat as the night deepened. Rain tapped softly against the windows while conversation drifted through the warm common room in low murmurs. Most patrons had returned to eating or drinking after the earlier grim attack outside the city walls. Garion sat at the table near the back corner, turning a cup of hot tea slowly between his hands. Everything about this world still felt unreal. The lights, the machines, the weapons, even the air itself felt different somehow. Across from him, Silk lounged comfortably in his chair, like he had spent his entire life in Vale, instead of arriving from another universe only hours earlier. "You know," the Drasnian said casually, "if we survive this, I fully intend to learn how those exploding hammer weapons work." "Of course you do," Belgarath muttered. The old sorcerer sat silently watching the room. Garion had learned long ago that when his grandfather became quiet, he was thinking. That usually meant trouble. The inn door opened. Cold night air swept briefly into the room. Garion looked up automatically. The woman entering moved with calm confidence. Tall, elegant, dangerous. She wore dark clothing with a long white coat, what looked like a riding crop in her hand, and carried herself with the kind of authority Garion had seen in generals and queens. Several people in the inn immediately recognized her. Garion noticed the subtle reactions. Respect, a little nervousness. The woman adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room once. Her eyes stopped instantly on their table. Silk sighed softly, and here comes the questioning. The woman approached without hesitation. "Good evening," she said politely. Her tone was calm, measured, not hostile, but very observant. Belgarath gestured lazily toward the empty chair. "Sit down if you're going to interrogate us." One eyebrow lifted slightly. "Direct." "Efficient," Silk corrected. The woman sat. "My name is Glinda Goodwitch. I teach at Beacon Academy." Garion exchanged a quick glance with Silk. They had heard that name mentioned repeatedly throughout the inn. Beacon clearly mattered in this world. "I'm Garion," he replied carefully. "This is Belgarath and Prince Keldar." Silk smiled faintly. "Most people call me Silk." Glinda studied each of them in turn. Garion had the distinct feeling she missed very little. "You fought outside the walls tonight," she said. "Quite effectively." "We noticed the creatures were trying to kill us," Silk replied. "We adapted accordingly." A faint hint of amusement touched Glinda's expression before vanishing. "Those creatures are called Grim. We've gathered that much," Belgarath said. "Interesting monsters." Glinda's eyes narrowed slightly at the word monsters. "You speak as though you've encountered similar things before." Belgarath shrugged. "Not similar, worse." Belgarath, remembering their recent fight with the Algroth in his world. Garion decided honesty was probably the better approach. "We're not from here," he admitted. Glinda became very still. Explained the surrounding sounds of the inn seemed suddenly distant. Garion glanced toward Belgarath. The old sorcerer gave a tiny nod. "Careful truth, then." "We come from another world," Garion said quietly. Glinda stared at him for several seconds. She did not laugh. did not dismiss the idea. That alone surprised him. Another world, she repeated. Yes. And how exactly did you arrive in Remnant? Belgarath answered this time. A group of extremely foolish demon worshippers attempted a summoning ritual. They tore open something they didn't understand. Glinda's expression sharpened. Magic. The old sorcerer looked mildly surprised. You know of magic. Very few people use it seriously anymore, Glinda replied. But yes. Belgarath leaned back slightly. Then your world remembers more than I expected. Glinda folded her hands neatly. If what you're saying is true, then your arrival here may have significant consequences. We already noticed the monsters, Silk said dryly. Not what I meant. Her eyes shifted toward Garion. The power you used outside the walls? That wasn't dust. Garion instinctively touched the cloth-wrapped orb at his side. No. Glinda noticed the movement instantly. What is that? Belgarath answered before Garion could. Dangerous, Silk snorted. That's probably the most accurate answer you'll get tonight. For several long moments, Glinda simply watched them, evaluating, judging. Garion realized she was deciding whether they posed a threat. Finally, she spoke again. What are you looking for? The directness of the question surprised him. Garion answered honestly. A way home. Something in Glinda's expression softened slightly. And until then, Belgarath sighed. Information, understanding. Preferably a place to sleep without being attacked by nightmare creatures every 10 minutes. That almost earned a smile. Almost Glinda stood. I believe you don't intend harm towards the kingdom. Silk looked pleased. That's encouraging. However, she continued, there are people who need to speak with you. Belgarath's eyes narrowed. Your headmaster? For the first time, Glinda looked genuinely surprised. How did you know that? You carry authority, Belgarath replied. But not ultimate authority. Silk gestured toward the old man. He's annoyingly perceptive. Glinda ignored that. Professor Ozpin has requested your presence at Beacon Academy. Garion frowned. Tonight. Immediately. Belgarath slowly rose to his feet. Very well then, the trip to Beacon only deepened Garion's sense that he had entered a dream. The aircraft waiting atop a landing platform near the city center looked like something out of a fevered imagination. Sleek black metal, rotating engines, lights glowing beneath the wings. Silk stared upward appreciatively. Now this, he announced, is impressive. Garion was less enthusiastic once they were airborne. The city of Vale spread beneath them in glittering patterns of light. Towering skyscrapers rose between parks and bridges, while distant airships drifted slowly across the night sky. Beyond the city walls stretched endless darkness, the grim, infested wilderness. Beacon Academy sat upon towering cliffs overlooking the kingdom. Even Garion had to admit it was magnificent. Ancient towers and modern structures blended together seamlessly. The academy looked both fortress and castle. Students moved through the halls despite the late hour. Many openly carried weapons larger than themselves. Nobody seemed particularly concerned by it. Garion tried not to stare too much. He failed. As Glinda led them through one of the wide upper corridors, two girls emerged from around a nearby corner. One wore a red cloak and carried an enormous scythe strapped across her back. The other walked with composed elegance in white and pale blue. Both stopped immediately upon seeing the newcomers. Ruby Rose's silver eyes widened. Whoa! Weiss Schnee blinked. They're not students. Garion noticed them briefly as he walked past. The younger girl looked excited enough to burst. Silk noticed too. We're attracting attention already, he murmured. You carry a glowing ancient sword. Belgarath replied. Attention was inevitable. Glinda continued walking without slowing. Behind them, Ruby grabbed Weiss by the sleeve. Did you feel that? Weiss frowned. Feel what? Something weird. Ruby lowered her voice excitedly, especially from the sword guy. Weiss glanced back down the corridor. They were with Professor Goodwitch, which means they're important. Or dangerous. Probably both, Ruby grinned. Yang is never going to believe this. Minutes later, the door to Team Ruby's dorm burst open. Yang looked up from her bed. "Why do you two look like you found buried treasure?" Ruby pointed dramatically toward the hallway. "Mysterious strangers." Blake slowly lowered her book. "That's either very good or very bad." "3 of them," Weiss added, and Professor Goodwich personally escorted them through the upper halls. Yang immediately sat upright. "Okay, now I'm interested." Ruby practically bounced with excitement. "One of them had this glowing sword, and there was this weird energy around all of them, and I swear they looked like they walked straight out of a fantasy novel." Blake's ears twitched slightly. Beneath her bow, did Ozpin call them in? "Has to be," Weiss replied. Yang grinned broadly. "Well, Beacon just got a lot more interesting." Far above the student dormitories, Glinda Goodwich stopped before a large office door. She turned toward the 3 strangers from another world. "Professor Ozpin is waiting for you." Then she opened the door. Chapter 4. Ancient Men and Ancient Secrets. Professor Ozpin's office was quieter than Garyon expected. Warm light from tall lamps illuminated shelves overflowing with books, maps, and strange artifacts gathered from across Remnant. Large circular windows overlooked the sleeping kingdom of Vale, far below Beacon Tower, and at the center of the room sat the man himself. Professor Ozpin appeared entirely ordinary at first glance. Calm, well-dressed, relaxed behind his desk with a steaming cup of coffee resting near one hand. Yet the moment Belgarath stepped through the doorway, Garyon felt his grandfather become wary. Not frightened, never frightened, but alert, interested. Ozpin rose politely. "Welcome to Beacon Academy," he said. His voice carried a quiet calmness Garyon immediately recognized, the kind possessed by people who had seen far too much. "Thank you for receiving us." Belgarath replied. Glinda noticed the subtle shift instantly. The old sorcerer's tone had changed. More formal, more cautious. Ozpin gestured towards several chairs near the desk. "Please, sit." Silk settled comfortably into one seat, while Garyon remained standing for a moment longer, studying the office. Belgarath sat last. His eyes never fully left Ozpin. For several moments, silence filled the room. Not awkward silence, measured silence. 2 ancient minds evaluating one another. Ozpin finally smiled faintly. "I suspect introductions may not be entirely necessary at this point." "Probably not," Belgarath agreed. Ozpin folded his hands together. "Then perhaps honesty would serve us better than formalities." Belgarath grunted softly. "That's usually the quickest route." Garyon noticed Glinda watching the exchange carefully. She clearly realized something unusual was happening. Ozpin's gaze shifted toward Belgarath. "You sensed it immediately, didn't you?" Belgarath's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're old," Glinda blinked. Silk covered a grin with one hand. Ozpin merely chuckled. "That obvious? To me?" "Yes." Belgarath leaned back slightly. "You're hiding it well, though. Most people wouldn't notice." Ozpin studied him quietly. "And yet you did." "I've had practice." Garyon looked between them. "Would somebody mind explaining what exactly is happening?" Silk pointed casually between the 2 older men. "Ancient immortal recognition." "Silk," Garyon warned. "What?" "I'm simplifying." Ozpin's faint smile returned. "Your friend is not entirely incorrect." That immediately drew Garyon's full attention. Belgarath spoke before he could. "You're not human anymore." "Not entirely, but it's complicated." The old sorcerer tilted his head slightly. "Or perhaps you were human once and became something else over time." Even Glinda looked startled by that observation. Ozpin was silent for several seconds. Then he nodded once. "A close enough conclusion." Belgarath snorted softly. "I've lived a very long time. You notice patterns eventually." Ozpin reached for his coffee. "Then perhaps we should begin properly." His eyes moved toward Garyon. "You truly are from another world." Garyon nodded. "We were fighting demon worshippers when some kind of portal opened. And now you're here," Ozpin murmured. Apparently, Silk replied. Ozpin considered that carefully. Remnant has encountered strange phenomena before, but dimensional displacement on this scale is unusual. Belgarath folded his arms. Your world feels damaged. That caught Ozpin completely off guard. Garion saw it instantly. A flicker, pain, gone almost immediately. An interesting choice of words, Ozpin said quietly. Accurate ones, Belgarath replied. The old sorcerer looked around the office slowly. Magic has been broken here, diluted, fragmented. I can feel the remains of it everywhere. He glanced toward Ozpin. And I can feel that you carry part of what's left. Glinda stiffened. Ozpin remained calm. You understand quite a bit already. Enough. For several moments nobody spoke. Finally Ozpin sighed. Very well. He looked toward Glinda briefly before returning his attention to the newcomers. There is still magic in this world, but very little. Garion leaned forward slightly. Ozpin continued. Long ago, humanity possessed abilities far beyond what exists today. That age ended in catastrophe. His voice grew quieter. Now true magic survives only in a handful of individuals. Belgarath listened intently. Yourself, he guessed. Ozpin nodded. My enemy. Something ancient and weary entered his expression. And 4 women known as the Maidens. Garion frowned. Maidens, centuries ago, Ozpin explained. I entrusted fragments of my own magic to 4 souls. Their power passes from one young woman to another upon death. Silk blinked. That's either incredibly noble or incredibly reckless. Ozpin smiled tiredly. Perhaps both. Belgarath's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Interesting. You distributed power externally to preserve it through generations. You are partially right, but it seems you have seen this before? Of course. Though we do things differently, where we come from. Ozpin leaned back slightly. I would like very much to hear about that. Garion glanced toward his grandfather. Belgarath rarely enjoyed explaining things. Surprisingly, this time he did not seem annoyed. Magic in our world isn't inherited the way yours appears to be. The old sorcerer began. It comes from understanding the structure of creation itself. Ozpin listened carefully. Even Glinda appeared fascinated. Belgarath continued. The universe has a language beneath reality. The will and the word are methods of imposing intention upon that structure. He tapped one finger against the arm of his chair. But there are rules, balance, consequences. Garion recognized that tone. Teaching tone. Belgarath almost never used it willingly. Most people cannot use the word, the old man continued. The mind isn't strong enough, and improper use destroys the body or the sanity. His gaze shifted briefly toward Garion. And some powers are dangerous beyond measure. Ozpin's eyes moved toward the cloth-wrapped orb at Garion's side, the object he carries. The room suddenly felt heavier. Garion instinctively touched the orb. The jewel pulsed faintly beneath the cloth. Belgarath's expression hardened slightly. The orb of Uldur, even speaking the name, seemed significant somehow. Ozpin sat very still. Tell me, the orb is not merely a source of power, Belgarath said quietly. It is power, living power shaped by one of our world's gods, and it has a type of sentience of its own. He paused. It chooses its bearer, and through it, entire kingdoms have risen or fallen. Glinda looked sharply toward Garion. A god created it? Not exactly. It was dormant, a stone that fell from the heavens, and Uldur recovered it, and through his efforts brought it back to, let's just use the word life. The simplicity of the answer made it somehow more unsettling. Ozpin studied Garion carefully. And you wield this power safely? Garion hesitated. Belgarath answered for him. Mostly, Silk coughed into one hand. That's an optimistic assessment. Garion ignored him. Ozpin's gaze remained fixed on the orb. I felt it the moment you entered Vale, he admitted. The power was unlike anything in Remnant. Belgarath nodded once. It should be. The old sorcerer leaned forward slightly. Now my turn. his eyes locked onto Ozpin's. Your enemy, the Immortal One. What exactly are we dealing with in this world? Something cold entered the room. Ozpin's calm expression dimmed. For the first time since entering the office, Garion sensed genuine exhaustion from the headmaster. Ancient exhaustion. Her name, Ozpin said softly, is Salem. Chapter 5. Breakfast at Beacon. The next morning, Garion discovered Beacon Academy never truly seemed to sleep. Students moved through the halls even at sunrise, carrying books, weapons, and enough energy to exhaust entire armies. Somewhere in the distance, metal clanged rhythmically while bursts of gunfire echoed from the outdoor training grounds. Garion still was not entirely used to the fact that students here casually carried weapons powerful enough to level buildings. Silk, meanwhile, appeared delighted by the entire experience. This place is fascinating, the Drasnian announced as they entered Beacon's massive dining hall. Hundreds of students filled long rows of tables beneath towering windows. The smell of breakfast drifted through the air while conversations overlapped into near chaos. Garion paused just inside the entrance. How does anyone think in here? They probably don't, Silk replied. That seemed increasingly plausible. Several students noticed them immediately. Word had clearly spread overnight. Garion ignored most of the looks and followed Silk toward the serving line. The sheer variety of food alone was bewildering. Silk picked up a tray with complete confidence. When in doubt, he advised, always begin with breakfast. Garion grabbed something that vaguely resembled eggs. At least he hoped they were eggs. Before they could find an empty table, an excited voice suddenly called out across the dining hall, "Hey, sword guy!" Garion blinked. Ruby Rose waved enthusiastically from one of the long central tables. Beside her sat Weiss, Blake, and Yang. Across from them sat 4 other students. Garion vaguely recognized from the hallways. A tall, blonde young man, a red-haired woman in armor, a dark-haired boy with calm eyes, and an extremely energetic girl currently balancing several pancakes on top of each other. Ruby pointed toward the empty spaces beside them. Come sit with us, Garion looked uncertainly toward Silk. The Drasnian grinned. Well, you've already been named Sword Guy. There's no escaping now. They crossed the dining hall and sat down. Ruby immediately leaned forward with visible excitement. I'm Ruby Rose. We saw you guys last night with Professor Goodwitch, we noticed. Silk replied smoothly. I'm Yang, the blonde beside Ruby said with a grin. Blake, Weiss Schnee. Weiss introduced herself more formally. Across the table, the blonde young man waved. John Ark. The armored redhead nodded. Pyrrha Nikos. Lai Ren, the dark-haired boy said calmly. The Pancake Tower girl beamed. Nora Valkyrie. Garion had the distinct impression Nora possessed enough energy to power the entire academy. Ruby leaned forward even farther. Okay, so first question, where are you from? Silk immediately pointed toward her. Direct. I like her. Ruby tends to skip subtlety. Weiss sighed. It's more efficient, Ruby protested. Garion exchanged a brief glance with Silk. Ozpin had advised them earlier that morning not to reveal too much publicly yet. Belgarath, however, had merely shrugged and gone wandering somewhere inside the academy. That alone was mildly terrifying. We're travelers, Garion answered carefully. Yang snorted. That is absolutely not the full story. Very perceptive, Silk replied. Pyrrha studied them thoughtfully. The energy around your weapons feels unusual, she observed. Garion immediately became more alert. You can sense that, Pyrrha nodded. A little Ruby suddenly brightened. Speaking of weapons, your sword is amazing. She pointed excitedly. What kind of metal is it made from? Does it transform? Is the blue glow dust-powered? Garion blinked several times. Transform? Ruby gasped softly. Wait, it doesn't transform. Silk leaned toward Garion slightly. You've disappointed her already, I noticed. Ruby looked genuinely heartbroken. But every cool weapon transforms. Weiss rubbed one temple. Please ignore her obsession with weapons. Never, RWBY declared proudly. Meanwhile, Silk had turned his attention fully toward Weiss. Garion recognized that look instantly. The Drasnian prince was gathering information, which usually meant trouble for someone eventually. "You mentioned dust yesterday," Silk said casually. Weiss nodded. "Everyone uses dust." "Not everyone," Blake corrected quietly. "Most people," Weiss amended. Silk rested his chin on one hand. "And what exactly is it?" Weiss looked mildly surprised. "You really aren't from around here." "We've established that." The white-haired heiress hesitated briefly before answering. "Dust is a naturally occurring energy source. It can be refined and used in combat, machinery, ammunition, almost everything." She frowned slightly. "You've honestly never encountered it before?" "Not remotely," Silk admitted. That answer seemed to intrigue the entire table. Meanwhile, Garion found himself looking toward RWBY and Nora. "Yesterday, people kept mentioning aura and semblances," he said. "What are those exactly?" That immediately lit up Nora's eyes. "Ooh, I can explain," Ren quietly sighed. "We're doomed." Nora pointed dramatically at Garion. "Aura is basically your soul, but outside your body, and it protects you from getting smashed into tiny pieces during fights." Garion stared. That explanation somehow raised more questions. RWBY nodded enthusiastically. "Okay, think of it like a shield powered by your spirit. Most huntsmen unlock their aura so they can survive grim attacks." Garion considered that. "Interesting. In some ways it sounded vaguely similar to protection sorcerers occasionally used, though apparently universal here." "And semblances?" he asked. RWBY pointed toward Yang. "Special abilities connected to your aura. Everybody's is different." Yang smirked. "Mine lets me hit harder the more I get hit. Mine creates glyphs," Weiss added. Blake hesitated briefly. "Shadow clones." RWBY grinned proudly. "And mine makes me really fast." Nora slammed both hands onto the table. "And I get stronger with electricity." Silk stared at her. "Naturally." Garion frowned thoughtfully. "So every person in this world has access to powers like this?" "Potentially," Pyrrha explained. "Not everyone unlocks their aura." "Still," Garion muttered, "a world where nearly anyone could wield supernatural abilities explained quite a lot." Silk tapped one finger lightly against the table. "And Grimm are fought primarily by these huntsmen and huntresses." Jorn nodded. "Pretty much," Yang grinned. "Best job in the world." "Debatable," Blake said. RWBY suddenly leaned closer toward Garion. "Okay, your turn." Her silver eyes sparkled with excitement. "What was that blue energy around your sword?" The table went quiet. Garion hesitated. Ozpin had warned them carefully. Magic was not something openly discussed in Remnant. Before he could answer, another familiar voice spoke from behind them. "Complicated," Belgarath said. Everyone turned. The old sorcerer stood nearby, holding a cup of coffee and looking mildly annoyed at existence in general. Garion had no idea how long he had been standing there. Belgarath glanced around the table once. "You lot ask more questions than diplomats." "That's because we're curious," RWBY replied instantly. Belgarath grunted. Dangerous habit. Despite the words, Garion noticed the faintest trace of amusement in the old man's eyes, which probably meant the students had somehow passed an invisible test without realizing it. Chapter 6. Stories Between Worlds. Belgarath settled into the empty seat beside Garion with all the enthusiasm of a man attending his own execution. He sipped his coffee once and made a face. "Terrible," he muttered. "Then why are you drinking it?" Yang asked. "Because I'm old and stubborn." "Fair enough," Yang admitted. Around the table, curiosity had become nearly unbearable. RWBY looked seconds away from exploding. Jorn was trying and failing to appear casual. Even Weiss looked openly interested now. Belgarath noticed every bit of it. "All right," the old sorcerer sighed. "If this conversation continues, we should establish a few things clearly before the Red One vibrates herself into another dimension." RWBY blinked. "I do not vibrate." "You absolutely do," Yang said. RWBY pouted. Belgarath ignored them both. "First," he said calmly, "we are not from another kingdom." He paused. "Or another continent." The table quieted instantly. Belgarath's expression remained perfectly calm. We are from another world entirely. Different dimension, different universe. Call it whichever term makes you comfortable. Silence. Then Nora spoke. That is the coolest thing I have ever heard. Ren nodded once. That sounds like Nora. Jean blinked several times. Wait, seriously? Seriously, Silk confirmed. Weiss stared at them skeptically. That should be impossible. Belgarath shrugged. Yesterday was very unpleasant for all involved. Ruby leaned forward so fast she nearly fell over the table. Another universe? Like, actually another universe? Yes, Garyon answered. Whoa. Blake remained unusually quiet. Her golden eyes studied Belgarath carefully. You expect us to believe that rather easily, she observed. Belgarath looked mildly amused. You live in a world with soul-powered warriors fighting immortal shadow monsters beneath a shattered moon. I assumed your standards for impossible were flexible. Yang burst out laughing. Even Weiss struggled not to smile. Pyrrha leaned forward thoughtfully. Professor Ozpin believes you, doesn't he? Belgarath gave her an approving look. Sharp girl, Pyrrha looked faintly pleased. Garyon noticed something then. Belgarath was steering the conversation carefully, revealing enough truth to satisfy curiosity, but not too much. Yet, the old sorcerer stirred his coffee idly. Now then, he said, since we're exchanging impossible revelations, perhaps you children can answer a few questions yourselves. Ruby perked up immediately. About Remnant? Precisely. Belgarath's tone became lighter. Almost casual. Garyon knew better. His grandfather was probing, testing. You mentioned Grimm, Belgarath said. Creatures of darkness that have plagued this world for ages. Blake nodded, as far back as recorded history. And your kingdoms survive despite that. Barely sometimes, Jean admitted. Belgarath grunted softly. What about magic? The table shifted uncomfortably. Weiss frowned. Most people consider magic a fairy tale. Most people are wrong, Belgarath muttered. Ruby blinked. You know about magic already? Enough. Blake watched him carefully. Professor Ozpin told you something. Belgarath smiled slightly. Another sharp one. Yang leaned back in her chair. Okay, now I'm curious. Belgarath ignored her for the moment. Tell me about your history, he said. The students exchanged glances. Which part? Ren asked. The important parts. Pyrrha took the lead. Humanity used to live in scattered settlements, constantly threatened by Grimm. Eventually, the four kingdoms formed. Vale, Atlas, Mistral, and Vacuo. She paused briefly. There was also a major war about 80 years ago. The Great War, Weiss added. Belgarath listened intently. And before that, the table grew quieter. Blake frowned slightly. There's mythology, stories about gods and the origins of humanity, but nobody really knows how much is true, Ruby added. Belgarath's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Garyon recognized that sound. His grandfather had noticed something important. Silk noticed too. You're thinking again, the Dresnian said suspiciously. Dangerous habit, Belgarath replied absently. Blake set down her cup. All right, she said. Our turn again. Belgarath sighed dramatically. Persistent lot. You started it, Yang pointed out. Blake's gaze shifted toward Garyon. What about your world? The question settled over the table. You obviously know magic, Blake continued. You mentioned gods, and Grimm didn't exactly seem to surprise you after the initial shock. Her eyes moved between Belgarath and Garyon. What kind of place did you come from? Garyon hesitated. Belgarath did not. Complicated, the old man said. Everything with you is complicated, Silk observed. Yes, because people insist on making things difficult. Ruby looked fascinated. Are there huntsmen where you're from? Not exactly, Garyon answered. Sorcerers, some. Monster hunters. Quite a few, actually, Silk admitted. Nora leaned across the table excitedly. Do you have giant evil creatures? Yes, Garyon and Silk answered together. Awesome. No, Ren corrected gently. Not awesome. Belgarath finally set down his coffee. The humor faded slightly from his expression. Our world, he said quietly, has been at war for thousands of years. The table became still, not always openly, he continued. Sometimes through kingdoms, sometimes through religion, sometimes through prophecy. His eyes shifted briefly toward Garion, and sometimes through people. Weiss frowned thoughtfully. You were fighting someone when you arrived here. Yes, Garion admitted. Belgarath leaned back slightly. An enemy called Torak. The name itself seemed heavy somehow. Even the atmosphere around the table shifted. Who is he? RWBY asked softly. Garion hesitated. Belgarath answered for him. A god who wanted to remake the world according to his own madness. Dead silence. Jean blinked. You were fighting a god? Silk held up one finger. To be fair, he only partially qualifies as a god these days. Silk. I'm simplifying again. Yang stared openly at Garion. Wait, you mean actually fighting? Belgarath nodded once. Garion was on his way to kill him when we were pulled into your world. No one spoke. Even Nora looked stunned. Garion rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. It sounds worse when he says it out loud. Better, Silk corrected. Pyrrha studied Garion carefully now, not with fear, with understanding. That's why you fight the way you do, she murmured. Garion looked at her. What do you mean? You fight like someone carrying responsibility far larger than himself. Garion did not know how to answer that. Fortunately, RWBY spoke before the silence became unbearable. Okay, she said slowly. So let me make sure I understand this correctly. She pointed directly at Garion. You are a magic sword king from another universe who was literally on a quest to kill a dark god when demon cultists accidentally threw you into Remnant. Garion considered that. That is surprisingly accurate. RWBY stared for 2 full seconds. Then she grinned so widely it seemed physically impossible. That is the coolest thing that has ever happened at Beacon Academy. Weiss buried her face in one hand. Of course, that's your conclusion. Chapter 7. Steel and Semblances. Breakfast eventually dissolved into overlapping conversations, excited questions, and several increasingly elaborate attempts by Nora to determine whether Garion could defeat a Nevermore with one giant glowy sword swing. Garion was still trying to answer that when the dining hall doors opened. Professor Glinda Goodwitch entered with the kind of purposeful stride that immediately quieted nearby students. Her sharp eyes swept the room once before landing squarely on teams RWBY and JNPR. There you are, she said. Yang groaned theatrically. That tone means work. Correct, Glinda replied without sympathy. Your scheduled sparring sessions begin in 15 minutes. RWBY immediately brightened. Oh, right. Then she turned toward Garion with visible excitement. You guys should come watch. RWBY, Weiss began cautiously. What? RWBY asked. They fight giant monsters and evil gods. Sparring matches probably won't bother them. Silk smirked. She's got a point. Belgarath sighed into his coffee. I knew staying here would eventually involve exercise. You don't actually exercise, Silk pointed out. At my age, surviving counts as exercise. Despite the complaints, all 3 rose from the table and followed the students from the dining hall. The training arena beneath Beacon Academy was enormous. Tiered seating overlooked multiple combat platforms surrounded by reinforced barriers and glowing screens displaying combat statistics. Garion stared upward appreciatively. This is a school. Beacon takes combat seriously, Pyrrha explained. Clearly, students and instructors filled the arena already. Several recognized Team RWBY and Juniper immediately. More than a few curious glances shifted toward Garion, Silk, and Belgarath. Belgarath ignored all of them with centuries practiced skill. Glinda moved toward the central platform. Standard tournament rotation today, she announced. Controlled sparring only. Excessive damage to school property will result in disciplinary action. Yang looked offended. Why are you looking directly at me? Experience, Glinda replied. The matches began quickly. Garion found himself unexpectedly fascinated. The students of Beacon fought unlike anything he had ever seen. Weapons shifted forms mid-combat. Explosions punctuated sword strikes. Semblances transformed the battlefield constantly. RWBY became a whirlwind of red motion. Yang fought like a cheerful avalanche. Blake moved like living shadow. And Weiss fought with precise elegance that reminded Garion faintly of certain Tolnedran duelists. "Interesting," Belgarath murmured from beside him. The old sorcerer watched the battles carefully. "Their abilities are tied directly to identity and temperament," he observed. "Very personal manifestations." Silk lounged comfortably in the spectator seats. "You're analyzing children again. Habit." Several matches later, Pyrrha stepped onto the central platform. The crowd immediately reacted. Garion noticed the whispers, recognition, admiration. Pyrrha clearly had a reputation here. Glinda glanced toward the seating area, then unexpectedly toward Garion. "Mr. Garion," she called. Every head in the arena turned instantly. Garion blinked. "Yes. Would you care to participate in the next sparring match?" The arena immediately erupted into excited murmuring. RWBY nearly launched herself out of her seat. "Yes," Weiss sighed, subtle as always. Garion looked uncertainly toward Belgarath. The old sorcerer shrugged. "Good opportunity to learn how these people fight." Silk grinned broadly. "Besides, if you embarrass yourself, I'll remember it forever." Very encouraging. "I try." Pyrrha stood calmly on the opposite side of the arena platform. She offered Garion a respectful nod as he stepped forward. "I've been looking forward to seeing how you fight," she admitted. Garion unsheathed the sword of the Revan King. Blue light shimmered faintly along the blade. A murmur rippled through the arena. Even students accustomed to unusual weapons paused at the sight. Glinda raised one hand. "Begin." Pyrrha moved instantly. Her spear flashed forward with astonishing speed. Garion barely deflected the strike in time. The impact jarred his arms. Fast. Far faster than most human fighters he had encountered. Pyrrha flowed seamlessly into another attack. Shield, spear, precise, controlled. Garion gave ground carefully while studying her movements. She fought with discipline rarely seen outside elite military orders. The crowd cheered as blades clashed repeatedly across the platform. Then Garion felt it, a subtle tug against his sword. His balance shifted unexpectedly. Pyrrha's shield slammed into his shoulder. The impact knocked him backward. Yang whistled. "Nice one, Pyrrha!" Garion recovered quickly, but now he understood. "Semblance," he muttered. Pyrrha smiled faintly, observant. She attacked again. This time Garion watched more carefully. Tiny shifts, moments where his sword pulled slightly off course, his belt buckle shifted, metal responding invisibly to her will. Magnetism, he realized. Pyrrha looked genuinely surprised. Most people don't figure it out that quickly. I've spent too much time around sorcerers. Garion lunged forward. The sword of the Revan King flashed brilliantly. Pyrrha twisted aside, but the blue energy trailing the strike sliced through the arena floor behind her. The entire audience gasped. Glinda's eyes narrowed immediately. "Controlled sparring, Mr. Garion." "Sorry." Silk laughed openly from the stands. At least he didn't level the building. Yet, Belgarath added, the fight intensified. Pyrrha adapted quickly. So did Garion. Again and again, her semblance subtly disrupted his movements. Again and again, Garion compensated through instinct and raw skill. Neither gained a decisive advantage. The audience became completely absorbed. Even Weiss leaned forward slightly. "He's adapting," she murmured. Blake nodded very quickly. RWBY looked thrilled beyond words. "This is amazing." Pyrrha struck high. Garion blocked. Her shield slammed low. He twisted aside. Then both fighters stepped back simultaneously, breathing hard, watching one another carefully. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then they attacked at the exact same instant. Spear and sword collided in a brilliant burst of sparks and blue light. The shockwave echoed across the arena. Both fighters were thrown backward several feet. Silence. Then Glinda raised one hand. Enough. Garion lowered his sword slowly. Pyrrha straightened. For one long moment, they simply regarded one another. Then Pyrrha smiled.
Draw.
Garion returned the smile. Draw! The arena erupted into applause. RWBY practically vibrated with excitement again. Yang laughed loudly. Okay, that was awesome. As Garion returned toward the seating area, another voice suddenly drifted from nearby. Not bad, kid. Garion looked up. A dark-haired man leaned casually against the arena entrance, holding what smelled unmistakably like alcohol despite the early hour. His red cloak hung loosely over one shoulder, while sharp crimson eyes studied the arena with lazy amusement. RWBY immediately brightened. Uncle Crow. Crow Branwen lifted one hand casually. Hey, kiddo. Then his gaze shifted toward Silk. The two men stared at one another for several seconds. Garion immediately became nervous. That expression on Silk's face usually preceded terrible decisions. Crow smirked first. You look like trouble. Silk grinned. Habit. Ha! I like him already, Crow declared. Within minutes, the two were seated together near the arena entrance, exchanging increasingly cynical observations about governments, authority figures, and human stupidity. Kings are usually idiots, Crow stated. Most rulers are, Silk agreed. The competent ones become terrifying. You ever notice secret organizations always think they're smarter than everybody else? Usually right before catastrophic failure, Crow barked out a laugh. RWBY looked horrified. Oh no, there's two of them now. Belgarath closed his eyes slowly. The world's doomed. Chapter 8. Shadows beneath the tower, far beneath the shining towers of Vale, where the city's warmth gave way to rusted pipes and forgotten tunnels, another meeting was taking place. Unlike Beacon's cheerful breakfast conversations and crowded training arenas, this gathering carried the weight of conspiracy and violence. A dim electric lamp flickered overhead. Roman Torchwick lounged comfortably in a stolen leather chair, with one boot propped atop a battered crate while casually twirling his cane between gloved fingers. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Roman drawled. Beacon's doubling security for the festival, Ozpin's bringing in outside huntsmen. Atlas is parking an entire fleet over Vale. He sighed dramatically. And somehow we're still proceeding with the plan. Across the room, Mercury Black smirked faintly. Complaining already. I'm a criminal mastermind, Mercury. Complaining is part of the brand. Emerald Sustri leaned against the wall nearby. Green eyes narrowed thoughtfully. You complain when you're nervous. Roman scoffed. I complain constantly. You'll need to be more specific. At the center of the room stood Cinder Fall. Unlike Roman, she showed no outward frustration, only calm certainty. The dim light reflected in her amber eyes as she studied several holographic screens displaying Beacon Academy, student records and tournament schedules for the upcoming Vital Festival. Everything proceeds as planned, Cinder said smoothly. Roman tilted his head. Even with the new variables, Cinder's eyes shifted toward another screen. A still image taken from Vale's outer wall showed a young man wielding a glowing blue sword against Grim. Garion, the image quality was poor, but the impossible blue light remained unmistakable. Mercury folded his arms. Those are the strangers people keep talking about. 3 unidentified individuals. Emerald confirmed. No records, no kingdom origin, no known huntsman licenses. Roman snorted. Wonderful, mysterious wandering warriors appearing out of nowhere. That never causes problems. Cinder remained silent for several moments. Then, possibly, she admitted. That immediately drew everyone's attention. Roman lowered his cane slightly. Oh, so they are worth worrying about. Worth observing, Cinder corrected. Emerald frowned. There are rumors they're staying at Beacon. That part is confirmed, Mercury replied. One of our contacts saw them training yesterday. Roman blinked. Already? Ozpin moves fast. Mercury smirked faintly. One of them fought Pyrrhanikos to a draw. That finally caused Roman to sit upright. Seriously? Seriously? Roman's expression darkened slightly. Well, that's unpleasant. Emerald crossed her arms. There's more. Her gaze moved toward Cinder briefly. People are saying the old man with them uses actual magic. Silence lingered briefly. Then Roman burst out laughing. "Oh, come on." "No," Emerald insisted. "Some students are already spreading stories." Roman waved one hand dismissively. Beacon students also spread stories about secret tunnels, Ghost Grim, and Professor Goodwitch turning people into statues. "She does seem capable of that," Mercury muttered. Cinder finally stepped forward. The room quieted instantly. "Fear creates rumors," she said calmly, "especially in places like Beacon." Roman leaned back again. "So you're not concerned?" Cinder's gaze drifted once more toward Garion's image. The glowing sword, the strange blue light, something about it bothered her. Not enough to change course, but enough to remember. "Ozpin attracts unusual people," she said at last. "That has always been true." Mercury shrugged. "Even if they're strong, there's still only 3 of them, and they know nothing about Remnant," Emerald added. Roman's grin slowly returned, meaning they're walking blind into a war they don't even understand. Exactly. Cinder deactivated the holographic display with a single motion. "The vital festival remains our opportunity. The kingdoms will gather. Security will become complacent beneath the illusion of celebration." Her voice lowered slightly. "And when Beacon falls, the entire world will watch." Even Roman stopped joking at that tone, because beneath Cinder's calm confidence burned something far darker than ambition. Hatred. Purpose. Mercury pushed away from the wall. "So what's the play now?" Cinder's expression smoothed once more into composed certainty. "We continue preparations." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And we observe our unexpected visitors carefully." Roman rose from his chair with a sigh. "Well then." He adjusted his hat. "Here's hoping the mysterious sword people don't accidentally save the world before we get started." Emerald rolled her eyes. Mercury smirked, but Cinder did not smile. For just a moment, she remembered the image again, the impossible blue light, and somewhere deep in her instincts, something whispered a warning she could not quite explain. Chapter 9. Arrivals. The skies above veiled, darkened with steel. Massive airships drifted through the clouds in rigid formation, while smaller escort craft swept across the city in precise patrol patterns. Engines rumbled like distant thunder over the kingdom as civilians stopped in the streets to stare upward. Garion watched the fleet pass overhead through one of Beacon Tower's tall windows. "They certainly know how to make an entrance here," he observed. Behind him, Professor Ozpin calmly sipped his coffee. "General Ironwood rarely does anything halfway." Belgarath snorted softly from where he lounged near the far wall. "That usually indicates either paranoia or military thinking." "Sometimes both," Glinda admitted. A loud mechanical hum echoed outside the tower as one of the larger transports settled onto Beacon's landing platform. Ozpin set down his cup. "Right on schedule." Moments later, the office doors opened. The man entering looked every bit the military commander Garion expected. Tall, broad-shouldered, severe, General James Ironwood carried himself with rigid discipline that reminded Garion faintly of Tolnedran generals, though the metallic nature of part of his body immediately marked him as something entirely different. Behind him walked a younger woman in pristine white military attire. Her pale hair and composed expression immediately caught Garion's attention. More specifically, her resemblance to Weiss. "Winter," Glinda greeted politely. Winter Schnee inclined her head respectfully. "General," Ozpin said calmly. Ironwood nodded once before his attention shifted immediately toward Belgarath. Then Garion, then Silk. His eyes narrowed fractionally. Military assessment, threat evaluation. Garion recognized it instantly. "So," Ironwood said carefully, "these are the visitors." Silk smiled pleasantly. "That makes us sound much more civilized than mysterious interdimensional strangers." Ironwood did not smile. Winter, however, looked faintly intrigued. Ozpin gestured calmly. General Ironwood Specialist Winter Schnee, allow me to introduce Belgarath, Belgarian, and Prince Keldar. Silk placed one hand against his chest dramatically. I prefer silk, fewer syllables. Belgarath ignored him. Ironwood folded his arms. Ozpin's explanation yesterday was difficult to believe. That seems to be a recurring theme, Belgarath replied dryly. Winter studied the old sorcerer carefully. Unlike Ironwood, her attention focused less on physical threat and more on composure, presence. Something about Belgarath immediately unsettled her instincts. Ozpin moved toward the center of the office. The short version, he said, is that our guests were displaced from another world during a magical incident involving what they described as demon summoning. Ironwood's expression did not change. Magic. Belgarath's eyes narrowed slightly. You say that like the word annoys you. Ironwood glanced briefly toward Ozpin. It complicates things. That, Belgarath replied, is the nature of magic. Winter finally spoke. You truly come from another universe? Garion nodded. Yes. Winter absorbed that answer with remarkable composure. Silk noticed immediately. You handled that revelation much better than most people. I was trained to adapt quickly. Military indeed, Silk murmured. Ozpin stepped beside the window overlooking Vale. Our guests have cooperated fully thus far, he explained, and they appear primarily interested in understanding Remnant and finding a method home. Ironwood's gaze shifted toward Garion's wrapped sword and orb, and the artifacts they carry. The room quieted slightly. Belgarath answered, dangerous. Ironwood looked unimpressed. That's not especially reassuring. It wasn't intended to be. Glinda suppressed what might have been the beginning of a smile. Winter's attention sharpened slightly at that exchange. Garion noticed something else. Belgarath was studying Ironwood almost as carefully as he had studied Ozpin, and judging by the old sorcerer's expression, he had already reached conclusions. Your machines are impressive, Belgarath remarked suddenly. Ironwood blinked once. Thank you. But you trust them too much. Silence. Ozpin closed his eyes briefly. Glinda looked like she expected this. Ironwood's expression hardened. You reached that conclusion quickly. I've watched civilizations for a very long time, Belgarath replied evenly. The more power people place in weapons and systems, the more catastrophic failure becomes when those systems break. Winter's posture stiffened slightly. Ironwood remained calm. Atlas technology protects millions. And one day, Belgarath said quietly, someone will try to turn it against you. The office became very still. Garion shifted uneasily, because judging by Ozpin's expression, Belgarath had struck dangerously close to an existing fear. Far below Beacon Academy, Vale streets buzzed with excitement. Colorful banners for the upcoming Vital Festival hung between buildings while vendors sold souvenirs, snacks, and tournament merchandise to growing crowds. Garion sat outside a busy cafe trying to process the fact that this world apparently turned combat tournaments into international celebrations. I still don't understand why people are so excited about students fighting each other, he admitted. It's fun, RWBY replied immediately. Yang grinned. And profitable. Weiss sipped her drink elegantly. The festival is one of the few times all four kingdoms gather peacefully. Blake sat quietly beside them, while Silk leaned comfortably back in his chair, watching the crowds with practiced awareness. Political theater disguised as entertainment, the Drasnian observed. Yang pointed at him. See, he gets it. RWBY looked offended. It's not just politics. There's also food, Nora added from across the table. Ren nodded solemnly. A great deal of food. Garion had learned quickly that Nora evaluated most events by snack availability. Silk's attention drifted lazily across the table, then stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly. Blake noticed immediately. What? Silk tilted his head. That bow of yours keeps moving. Instant silence. Blake froze. Yang winced softly. Weiss closed her eyes. Oh dear. Garion blinked. Now that Silk mentioned it, the black ribbon atop Blake's head did seem to twitch occasionally. Blake looked very tired suddenly. You noticed that quickly? Silk shrugged. I notice things professionally. Ruby leaned forward nervously. It's not a big deal. Blake sighed softly, then reached upward and untied the bow. Two black cat ears emerged from beneath her hair. Garion stared. Silk blinked once, then nodded calmly. Ah, that explains it. Blake looked almost suspicious at how little he reacted. That's all? What did you expect? Silk asked. I've met people who worshipped bears. That is unfortunately true, Garion admitted. Yang burst out laughing. Even Blake smiled slightly. Weiss folded her arms. Blake is a faunus, she explained carefully. Garion frowned. A what? Blake hesitated briefly, then answered herself. Faunus are people born with animal traits. Silk studied her ears thoughtfully. And your world treats this as unusual. The question carried enough meaning that Blake immediately understood it. Her expression dimmed slightly. Some people do more than treat it as unusual. Ruby shifted awkwardly. Weiss looked uncomfortable. Garion noticed instantly. There's conflict, he guessed. Blake gave a humorless smile. For a long time, Wren spoke quietly. Relations between humans and faunus have improved in some places. In some, Blake repeated carefully. Silk rested one elbow on the table. Prejudice, he said flatly. Civilizations really do repeat themselves endlessly. Blake looked at him curiously. You've seen this before? Belgariad answered before Silk could. In our world, people fight wars over race, religion, kingdoms, bloodlines. He shrugged tiredly. Usually because someone powerful benefits from it. Blake studied him silently for a moment, then slowly nodded. For the first time since meeting them, Garion noticed Blake looking slightly less guarded around the strangers from another universe. And above them all, far in the skies over Vale, Atlas warships continued drifting silently into position. Chapter 10, Souls of Steel Beacon Academy, had grown even louder following the arrival of Atlas. Students from every kingdom now filled the courtyards and training halls, while airships continuously passed overhead, carrying supplies, tournament staff, and competitors for the upcoming Vital Festival. To Garion, the entire academy increasingly resembled a military fortress pretending to be a school. Silk, on the other hand, was enjoying himself immensely. International politics, armed teenagers, secret conspiracies, mysterious powers. The Drasnian mused while walking beside Garion through Beacon's courtyard. Honestly, this place is barely different from Tol Honeth, Garion snorted. That's deeply concerning. Before Silk could answer, a cheerful voice suddenly called out nearby. Oh, there you are. Garion turned. A red-haired girl hurried toward them with startling enthusiasm and slightly unnatural precision in her movements. She wore an Atlas Academy uniform and smiled brightly enough to rival Ruby. General Ironwood said, I might meet you eventually, she announced happily. Silk blinked once. Well, that's either good news or deeply alarming. The girl thrust out one hand enthusiastically. I'm Penny Polendina. It is very nice to meet you. Garion shook her hand automatically and nearly winced. Strong grip, he managed. Penny immediately released him. Oh, apologies. I am still calibrating appropriate greeting pressure. Silk's eyes narrowed slightly. Calibrating. Penny froze. For exactly half a second, then smiled again. Yes. Garion exchanged a glance with Silk. The Drasnian's expression said the same thing Garion was already thinking. Something was unusual here. Penny tilted her head curiously. You are the interdimensional travelers. Ruby told me all about you. Garion sighed softly. Of course she did. Penny nodded enthusiastically. She said you fought giant monsters and dark gods and arrived through magical dimensional displacement. She paused. That sounds statistically improbable but extremely exciting. Silk stared at her, then slowly smiled. Oh, I like this one. They spent the next several minutes walking through Beacon's courtyard, while Penny bombarded them with cheerful questions about other worlds, monsters, magic, and whether Garion's sword could technically classify as advanced energy projection technology. Garion barely understood half the sentence, but something kept bothering him. Finally, Silk asked the question directly, "You're not human, are you?" Penny stopped walking. Nearby students continued moving around them, completely unaware of the sudden tension. Garion looked carefully at Penny again. The precise posture, the unnatural movement, the almost mechanical rhythm beneath her speech. Penny clasped her hands behind her back. "No," she admitted quietly. Then, almost nervously, "I am a combat android." Garion blinked. Silk stared openly. "You're a machine." "Yes." Penny smiled brightly again. Garion slowly circled around her once. "A machine that talks, yes, and thinks, yes, and fights grim, correct." Silk rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "This world becomes stranger every day," Garion frowned. "But you have emotions." Penny tilted her head. "Most people do." "That's not what I meant." Garion could feel it now. Something surrounding her. Faint, invisible, but undeniably present. "You have an aura." Penny's smile brightened further. "Yes, my father designed me specifically to generate and sustain an aura through a fragment of his own soul." Silence, complete silence. Garion and Silk stared at her, then slowly toward each other. Silk spoke first. "That may be the most terrifying sentence I have ever heard." Penny blinked. "Why?" Garion struggled to explain. "In our world," he said slowly, "souls aren't things people are supposed to divide and place into machines." Penny looked concerned. "Oh dear. Is that considered rude where you come from?" Silk burst out laughing. No, it's just profoundly unnatural." Penny frowned slightly. "But I'm perfectly natural to me." That answer stopped both of them cold. Garion stared at her, then unexpectedly smiled. "That's actually fair." Penny brightened instantly. "I am pleased you think so." Silk shook his head slowly. "Belgarath is going to hate this. Far beneath Vale, hidden beneath layers of ruined infrastructure and abandoned tunnels, another machine waited in darkness. Unlike Penny, this one existed only for destruction. A massive freight train sat motionless along cracked underground rails deep beneath Mountain Glen. Dust engines rumbled softly. White Fang operatives moved through the tunnels loading weapons, explosives, and cages filled with snarling grim drawn by artificial means. Roman Torchwick stood atop one of the train cars, adjusting his hat while surveying the chaos below. "Well," he announced, "this certainly feels like the sort of plan that ends in fiery disaster." Nearby, White Fang members continued preparations in grim silence. At the center of the operation stood Cinder Fall, Emerald, and Mercury waited beside her while holographic screens displayed Vale's rail systems and beacon security routes. Everything was nearly ready. Mercury glanced toward the grim cages uneasily. "I still hate these things." One of the creatures slammed violently against reinforced bars with a furious screech. Roman pointed his cane toward it. "See? That thing agrees with me. This entire operation lacks professionalism." Emerald rolled her eyes. "You complain more than normal criminals." "I am an artist, Emerald." Cinder ignored them all. Her eyes remained fixed on the glowing map of Vale. "When the signal comes," she said calmly, "the train will breach the city perimeter and release the Grim directly into Vale." Roman sighed dramatically. "Subtle. Panic is the objective," Cinder replied. Mercury smirked slightly. "Hard to panic, harder than unleashing an underground Grim invasion." Cinder's expression remained cold. "Fear weakens kingdoms faster than armies." Roman twirled his cane once. "And Beacon," Cinder's eyes narrowed slightly, "Beacon falls when trust collapses." The tunnel lights flickered briefly. Somewhere deeper within Mountain Glen, grim howls echoed through the darkness. Roman glanced toward the sound. "You know?" he said lightly, between immortal witches, secret conspiracies, robot girls with souls, and magical sword kings appearing out of nowhere. He adjusted his hat again. I'm starting to think this whole situation is becoming overly complicated. Mercury smirked. You just noticed? Roman sighed. I miss simpler crimes. Chapter 11, Weapons and Revelations. Beacon Academy had transformed completely. What had once seemed merely crowded now bordered on chaos. Students from every kingdom moved through the courtyards carrying luggage, weapons, banners, and enough competitive energy to fuel an invasion. Airships passed overhead constantly, while staff struggled to maintain order among hundreds of excited huntsmen in training. Garion stood near one of Beacon's upper walkways, watching the endless activity below. I miss quiet forests, he muttered. Silk leaned comfortably against the railing beside him. You hated quiet forests. I preferred them to this. That's because you're becoming old before your time. Garion glared at him. I'm only 15. Details, Silk replied with a smirk. Ahead of them. Team RWBY stood near the courtyard entrance talking animatedly with two unfamiliar boys who had apparently just arrived at Beacon. One wore jeans and an open white shirt, with untamed blonde hair and an easy grin that instantly reminded Garion of someone perpetually in trouble. The other looked considerably more composed, with dark blue hair and a relaxed confidence that Silk immediately distrusted on principle. RWBY noticed Garion and Silk first. There you guys are. The orange-clad newcomer turned immediately. Oh, the Dimension Travelers, Garion sighed. That title is spreading far too quickly. The newcomer grinned broadly. I'm Sun Wukong. Beside him, the blue-haired young man gave a casual salute. And I'm Neptune Vasilius. Silk, Silk replied smoothly. Garion. Sun's eyes immediately lit up as he noticed Garion's sword. Okay, that thing is awesome, RWBY pointed proudly. See? I told you. Neptune folded his arms. It glows. That automatically makes it at least 20% cooler. Scientific fact, Yang agreed. Sun casually rested a long staff across his shoulders. Garion barely noticed it. Silk, however, froze completely. His eyes narrowed, then widened. What exactly is that? Sun blinked. My weapon. Silk stepped forward immediately. May I? Sun exchanged a quick glance with Blake, then shrugged and handed it over. Silk turned the weapon carefully through his hands with the focus of a master thief evaluating crown jewels. A staff, he murmured. Then he pressed a mechanism accidentally. The weapon split apart instantly into twin nunchaku connected by a cable, while hidden firearm barrels rotated into place. Silk stared. What? Sun grinned proudly. Gunchucks, silence. Then Silk looked at RWBY, then back at the weapon, then back at RWBY again. I love this world. RWBY burst out laughing. I knew you'd appreciate huntsman weapons. Silk continued examining the weapon with growing fascination. It transforms and explodes. Most good weapons do, Yang said. Garion pinched the bridge of his nose. This is encouraging behavior for none of you. RWBY suddenly gasped. Oh, wait. Everyone turned toward her. RWBY pointed dramatically at Silk. I could help make you a remnant-style weapon. Silk blinked. Excuse me? You totally need one, RWBY insisted. Something sneaky and clever and dangerous. Neptune smirked. She's been wanting to redesign somebody's weapons for days. Weeks, Weiss corrected tiredly. RWBY ignored her. You use knives and hidden stuff and trick weapons already. She practically vibrated with excitement. You'd be perfect for custom engineering. Silk looked genuinely tempted, which worried Garion immensely. I don't think giving him transforming weapon technology is wise, Garion said carefully. Counterpoint, Yang replied. It would be hilarious. Sun nodded immediately. She's got a point. Silk twirled one of Sun's gunchucks thoughtfully. You know, he mused, a concealed launcher mechanism with rotating blade deployment. RWBY gasped again. Oh my gosh, you do understand weapon engineering language. Weiss groaned softly. We've lost them. Indeed, Ruby and Silk were already walking several steps away while discussing hidden compartments, spring-loaded blades, and something involving explosive misdirection. Garion watched them go with profound concern. That's going to end badly. Probably, Neptune agreed. Nearby, Blake folded her arms while watching Sun casually. You came earlier than expected. Sun grinned. Couldn't miss the festival. Then his eyes shifted toward Garion again. So you guys really came from another universe? Yes, Garion replied. Awesome, said Sun. That seems to be everyone's reaction. Garion responded. Sun shrugged. You should hear the stuff people say about Vacuo. Blake sighed softly. That explains absolutely nothing. While Ruby and Silk continued descending into dangerous engineering discussions nearby, Garion noticed Sun's tail moving casually behind him. Interesting. Unlike Blake, Sun made no attempt whatsoever to hide being a faunus. Silk noticed too. Eventually, he wandered back toward the group, while still enthusiastically sketching weapon ideas with Ruby on scraps of paper. I assume, Silk said casually toward Sun, that your people vary considerably. Sun blinked. Faunus. Silk nodded. Different animal traits, different appearances. Blake looked mildly surprised. You're adapting to this pretty quickly. Silk shrugged. Our world has Alorns, Drasnians, Nadraks, Tolndrans. He waved one hand vaguely. Humans divide themselves into tribes constantly. Animal ears barely seem worth the effort. Sun barked out a laugh. I like this guy. Neptune smirked. Yeah, he's got style. Blake studied Silk more carefully now. You really don't care? Silk blinked. About what? That people are faunus. Silk looked genuinely confused.
Why would I?
Blake stared at him for several seconds. Garion realized then how unusual that answer probably sounded in Remnant. Eventually, Blake looked away slightly. Sun grinned broadly. Told you Beacon needed more normal people. Vice opened her mouth, paused, then sighed. I can't even argue with that statement properly. Garion smiled faintly. For once, Blake actually looked relaxed, discussing the subject. Then Silk ruined everything. Well, the Drasnian continued casually. Garion's destined to marry a tree spirit eventually, so his standards for unusual relationships are already flexible. Silence. Absolute silence. Garion froze. Silk. Ruby blinked rapidly. A what spirit? Yang looked delighted instantly. Oh, this is going to be good. Blake tilted her head. Tree spirit? Sun looked fascinated. Neptune nearly choked, laughing. Garion pointed accusingly at Silk. You promised not to bring that up. I promised nothing, Silk corrected smoothly. Ruby leaned forward excitedly. Wait. You're engaged to a magical forest girl? She's a dryad, Garion muttered. That somehow raises more questions, Weiss observed. Sun looked deeply impressed. Dude. Garion buried his face in one hand. It's complicated. An ancient contract from about 500 years ago declared that when the Revan king returns, an eligible daughter of the kingdom of Tolnedra will bid to be his wife, Garion explained. And for the past 500 years, when a Tolnedran daughter turned 16, she had to present herself on Riva in case the rightful king returned. And the crux is that a different ancient agreement between a prince of the Borun family and an eligible girl from the community of Dryads agreed in a treaty to be married. And since the Boruns are still in power today, the Dryad strain for female offspring still runs true. Silk grinned. Yang immediately pointed at Garion. You absolutely cannot summarize that and walk away. Blake, surprisingly, looked genuinely interested now. A dryad, she repeated thoughtfully. Your world really is full of strange things. Garion sighed. You have robot girls with souls and transforming gun scythes. Fair point, Blake admitted. Meanwhile, Ruby had already become distracted again. Okay, but imagine, she said excitedly to Silk, hidden blade-launching gunchucks. Garion closed his eyes slowly. Somewhere in Beacon Academy, He was suddenly certain Belgarath had just sensed impending disaster without knowing why. Chapter 12. The vital festival tournament begins. The roar of the crowd shook the sky. Garion stood near the front railing of Amity Coliseum, staring upward in open disbelief, as thousands upon thousands of spectators filled the colossal floating arena suspended high above Vale. "I still cannot believe they made an airborne fortress exclusively for tournaments," he muttered. Beside him, Silk leaned comfortably against the railing, while casually eating something covered in sugar. "Priorities," the Drasnian replied wisely. Above them, massive holographic screens flashed team names, combat statistics, and tournament brackets, while aircraft circled around the enormous structure carrying reporters, officials, and spectators from across Remnant. The opening ceremonies of the vital festival had transformed Vale into the center of the world, and now the tournament itself was beginning. Belgarath stood nearby with his arms folded inside his cloak, looking deeply unimpressed by civilization in general. "That many people gathered in one place usually ends badly," the old sorcerer observed. "Optimistic as always," Silk replied. The arena lights suddenly dimmed, then exploded into brilliant color. The crowd erupted. A booming announcer's voice echoed across the stadium. "Welcome to the Vital Festival Tournament," the audience thundered with excitement. Garion winced slightly. "Do they really need to shout everything?" "Yes," Silk said immediately. "It's part of the spectacle." Across the arena floor, two platforms rose upward from beneath the stadium. On one side stood Team RWBY. RWBY spun crescent rows dramatically onto her shoulder, while Yang waved enthusiastically to the audience. Weiss stood with practiced composure, while Blake quietly surveyed the opposing team. Across from them stood Team Auburn from Haven Academy. Garion recognized none of them. Though judging by their confidence and the crowd's reaction, they were experienced fighters. RWBY spotted the three visitors from another world high in the stands and waved excitedly. Silk waved back lazily. Belgarath did not. The announcer's voice boomed again. "Team RWBY of Beacon Academy." Thunderous applause erupted. "Versus Team Auburn of Haven Academy." More cheers answered. Garion glanced around the arena. The sheer energy of the crowd unsettled him slightly. Not because of the excitement, because he could feel something beneath it. Pressure, emotion. Thousands of people feeding excitement, anticipation, aggression, pride. Belgarath noticed too. The old sorcerer's expression darkened faintly. "Interesting," he murmured. Garion looked toward him. "What?" Belgarath watched the crowd carefully. Their grim feed on emotion? "Yes." Garion nodded slowly. "That's what everyone says. Then this world has created a remarkably dangerous way to entertain itself." Before Garion could answer, the match began. RWBY moved first. A red blur exploded across the battlefield with astonishing speed, while rifle shots echoed through the arena. Team Auburn scattered instantly. One of their fighters barely avoided being launched off the platform entirely by Yang's opening punch. The audience roared approval. Garion leaned forward slightly. Even after days in Remnant, Huntsman combat still looked unreal to him. Weiss danced across the battlefield atop glowing glyphs, while Blake's shadow clones confused opponents repeatedly. Explosions, gunfire, blinding speed, all woven seamlessly together. Silk looked delighted. "It's like watching military strategy designed by lunatics." "That's because it is," Belgarath muttered. On the arena floor, Team Auburn adapted quickly. Their leader barked orders while coordinating attacks surprisingly well. One fighter wielded a massive axe rifle hybrid, while another unleashed streams of dust-enhanced fire across the battlefield. RWBY narrowly avoided a direct hit. Yang charged through the flames anyway. "Of course she did." Weiss sighed over team comms. Garion noticed something else then. Despite the chaos, Team RWBY trusted each other completely. Every movement flowed together instinctively. Blake vanished into shadow at precisely the moment Weiss launched a glyph beneath Yang's feet, sending the blonde huntress hurtling like artillery directly into two opponents. The crowd exploded with cheers again. Silk whistled appreciatively. "They're actually very good." "They should be," Belgarath replied. "Most of them are still alive." Garion blinked. "That's your standard." "I've lived a very long time," Belgarath said dryly. The battle intensified rapidly. Dust blasts shattered sections of the arena floor, while RWBY ricocheted through the battlefield with impossible momentum. Team Auburn fought hard, but Garion could see the momentum shifting. RWBY adapted faster, moved faster, trusted each other more. One opponent attempted to flank Weiss, only for Blake's ribbon weapon to snap around his ankle and yank him directly into Yang's fist. Aura shattered instantly. Combatant eliminated. The audience erupted again. Garion found himself smiling despite everything. "They really enjoy this." "They're young," Belgarath said quietly. Something ancient flickered behind the old sorcerer's eyes. "For young warriors, battle still feels glorious." Garion looked at him carefully. "And for old ones?" Belgarath watched the arena in silence. For several moments, necessary. Down below, RWBY launched herself skyward with a burst of recoil from Crescent Rose. Her scythe spun once, twice, then slammed downward with explosive force against the final remaining Auburn fighter. The platform cracked violently, aura shattered. Team RWBY wins. The Colosseum nearly exploded from cheering. RWBY pumped one fist into the air triumphantly, while Yang grabbed her into a headlock celebration immediately afterward. Weiss pretended not to smile. Blake quietly did anyway. Garion applauded lightly. Silk grinned. Well, Beacon's terrifying. Belgarath's attention, however, had drifted elsewhere. Toward the upper observation decks, toward the VIP sections, toward the shadows between smiling crowds and political dignitaries. Garion noticed immediately. "What is it?" The old sorcerer's eyes narrowed slightly. "There are too many important people gathered here," he said quietly. Silk's grin faded. "That bothering you?" "Yes." Below them, the celebrations continued, but high above the arena, unnoticed by nearly everyone present, Belgarath felt tension gathering, like distant thunder before a storm. Chapter 13. The weight of inheritance. The days passed quickly beneath the endless spectacle of the vital festival. Matches filled Amity Coliseum from morning until night, while students from every kingdom battled before roaring crowds and worldwide broadcasts. Beacon Academy thrived beneath the attention, at least on the surface. Beneath the celebration, tension continued to grow. Garion felt it increasingly. Belgarath sensed it constantly. Even Silk had stopped joking quite as much whenever Atlas security patrols passed nearby. Too many secrets, too many hidden agendas, too many powerful people watching one another carefully. And somewhere within Beacon Academy, Professor Ozpin was preparing for something. Pyrrha Nikos stood silently inside Ozpin's office. The room felt unusually crowded tonight. Ozpin stood beside the large circular window overlooking Vale, while Glinda Goodwitch remained near the far wall with her arms folded tightly. General Ironwood stood stiffly beside Winter Schnee, both visibly tense. Even Crow Branwen was present, leaning against the wall with his usual air of exhausted cynicism. Pyrrha immediately understood one thing. This was not a normal meeting. Ozpin turned toward her calmly. "Thank you for coming, Miss Nikos." Pyrrha nodded respectfully. "You said there was something important you wished to discuss?" Ozpin's expression softened slightly. "Yes." Silence lingered briefly. Then Ozpin spoke carefully. "Tell me, Pyrrha, what do you know of magic?" The question immediately unsettled her, not because of the word itself, but because of how seriously everyone in the room reacted to it. Pyrrha glanced between them. "Very little," she admitted. "Most people believe magic only exists in fairy tales." Crow snorted quietly. "Wouldn't that be nice?" Ozpin moved toward a hidden panel along the wall. "It is time," he said softly, "that you learned the truth." The hidden elevator descended deep beneath Beacon Tower, far below the academy, far below the city itself. Pyrrha stood silently beside Ozpin as ancient stone walls replaced modern steel and machinery. The deeper they traveled, the older everything became, older than beacon, older than veil. At the bottom waited a massive circular chamber illuminated by pale golden light, and at its center, a frail woman rested within an elaborate life support apparatus connected to countless machines and glowing conduits. Pyrrha froze. The woman looked old, not in years, in exhaustion, as though something fundamental inside her had been broken. Ozpin approached quietly. "This," he said gently, "is amber." Pyrrha stepped forward slowly. The woman's eyes opened weakly. For the briefest moment, faint embers of impossible power flickered around her. Wind stirred softly through the chamber despite the still air. Flames danced briefly along the edges of nearby machinery. Pyrrha stared. Magic. Ozpin nodded once. Yes. The headmaster remained silent for several moments before speaking again. Long ago, he began quietly, there was established 4 women who were gifted with extraordinary power. They became known as the First Maidens. As he spoke, holographic projections illuminated the chamber around them. 4 figures, 4 crowns of elemental light. Spring, summer, fall. Winter. Pyrrha listened carefully as Ozpin explained the ancient inheritance. Power passed from soul to soul, a legacy carried across generations, a hidden duty unknown to the world. Then his expression darkened. Amber was the latest fall maiden. Pyrrha looked toward the weakened woman again. What happened to her? Crow answered this time. She was attacked. Ironwood's jaw tightened visibly. Someone attempted to steal her power. Pyrrha's eyes widened slightly. That's possible? Ozpin nodded grimly. It is now apparently. We don't know fully how it was done, but for the first time in history, a portion of the maiden's power was stolen. The chamber grew heavy with silence. Pyrrha slowly pieced together the implications. Someone powerful enough to attack a maiden, someone dangerous enough to cripple her, and someone still out there. Ozpin stepped closer. Amber is dying. The words landed like stone. And without intervention, Ozpin continued softly, the Fall Maiden's power will pass randomly to another young woman somewhere in Remnant, or General Ironwood added, could seek out its other half. It is not out of the realm of belief that the last person in Amber's thoughts could be that of her assailant. Pyrrha looked toward him slowly, understanding dawning on her. Her breath caught slightly. Ozpin's expression carried genuine regret now. There may be a way to transfer the power intentionally. Pyrrha stared at him. You want me to become the next Fall Maiden? No one answered immediately, because there was no need. Pyrrha looked down at her hands silently. The weight of the moment pressed heavily against the chamber. Finally, she spoke quietly. Why me? Ozpin's answer came without hesitation. Because you are strong, Glinda added softly. Because you are kind. Ironwood folded his arms, and because we trust you. Pyrrha closed her eyes briefly. Responsibility, duty, expectation. They had followed her for years already. Now they threatened to become something far greater. Crow stepped forward slightly. No pressure, kid. Crow, Glinda warned. What? I'm being honest. Ozpin raised one hand gently. You are not required to answer tonight, but we will need to know your answer by the end of the vital festival. Pyrrha nodded slowly, but already she understood something terrible. If Ozpin was asking her now, then the situation was desperate. Elsewhere within Beacon Academy, 3 other conspirators prepared for a very different conversation. Cinder Falls stood within a darkened maintenance room beneath the arena, while Emerald and Mercury watched nearby. Several holographic displays floated before them showing tournament brackets, security schedules, and combat data. At the center of every projection she positioned 2 names, Pyrrha Nikos and Penny Polendina. Mercury smirked faintly. So the match is confirmed, Emerald nodded. Our adjustments worked perfectly. Cinder studied the projected tournament schedule silently, every movement, every outcome, every emotional pressure point, carefully arranged. Good, she said softly. Mercury crossed his arms. You really think this will work? Cinder's eyes narrowed slightly. It only needs to work once, Emerald shifted uneasily. Penny's stronger than most people realize. So is Pyrrha, Mercury replied. That is precisely why this pairing matters, Cinder said calmly. She deactivated one projection with a single motion, then another, until only the two names remained floating in darkness. Pyrrha versus Penny, a champion burdened by destiny, and a machine with a soul. Neither understood yet that they were walking toward catastrophe, but Cinder did. And somewhere deep below Beacon Tower, ancient magic stirred uneasily as the future of Remnant edged closer to disaster. Chapter 14. The Fall Begins. The atmosphere inside Amity Coliseum felt wrong. Garion noticed it immediately. The cheers sounded forced, too sharp, too strained. Even the air itself seemed heavy with tension as spectators filled every seat for the next round of the vital festival beside him. Belgarath watched the arena below with narrowed eyes. "You feel it too," Garion said quietly. The old sorcerer nodded once. "Yes." Silk frowned from nearby. "That's comforting." Below them, the arena platforms rose slowly into position. On one side stood Pyrrha Nikos, calm, focused, yet Garion noticed the strain hidden beneath her composure. She had barely slept in days. Whatever Ozpin had shown her in secret clearly weighed heavily upon her shoulders. Across from her stood Penny Polandina, bright smile, cheerful wave, completely unaware of the nightmare approaching. Ruby leaned nervously against the spectator railing nearby. "She'll be okay," she said quietly. Whether she meant Pyrrha or Penny, Garion wasn't entirely certain. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena. The next match of the vital tournament. Thunderous applause answered. Yet beneath the excitement, unease spread invisibly through the crowd. Far above the arena floor, hidden within Beacon's systems, Emerald Sustre activated her semblance. The illusion spread silently, subtly, perfectly. The match began. Pyrrha moved first. Her spear flashed brilliantly across the platform, while Penny answered with a storm of floating blades and crimson energy beams. The crowd erupted immediately. Garion leaned forward slightly. Penny fought unlike anyone else in Remnant. Her movements possessed impossible precision, perfect balance, mechanical accuracy wrapped in cheerful innocence. Pyrrha adapted quickly. Shield turning aside blasts, spear striking precisely, her semblance manipulating metal subtly throughout the fight. Back and forth they battled across the arena, fast enough that many spectators struggled to follow the exchanges. Then everything changed. Emerald's illusion struck. For a single horrifying instant, Pyrrha saw something that was not there. An opponent preparing a lethal attack, instinct took over. Her semblance surged violently. Penny's floating blades ripped suddenly out of formation. Garion's eyes widened instantly. No, too late. The metal wires attached to Penny's weapons snapped back towards her with catastrophic force. A dozen's razor-sharp blades tore directly through Penny's body, their attached strings twisting around and crushing her metal frame from the force. The arena froze. Silence crashed downward over thousands of people. Penny stood motionless for one terrible second. Then she just simply fell apart. Pyrrha staggered backward in horror. Her spear slipped from numb fingers. No! The giant stadium screens replayed the moment again and again and again. The audience saw Penny torn apart from every angle. Screams erupted throughout the Colosseum. Panic spread like wildfire. Ruby stared downward in absolute horror. Penny. Garion felt sick. Even Belgarath looked deeply disturbed. "Gods," Silk whispered. Below them, Pyrrha remained frozen amid the wreckage. The world had gone silent around her. Then every screen in the kingdom flickered. Static exploded across the displays. The tournament broadcast vanished, and a new image appeared. Cinder Fall. Her demeanor was both calm and smiling. Behind her, distorted images of violence, military forces, and grim flashed rapidly across the screens. Her voice echoed through Amity Coliseum. through Vale, through every active CCT terminal in the kingdom, in all kingdoms. People of Vale, she said smoothly. Panic intensified instantly. Ironwood rose from the VIP section in fury. Ospin. But it was already too late. Cinder continued speaking. You were promised safety. Images of Atlas warships filled the screens. You were promised protection, more images, weapons, armies, fear. But your leaders have lied to you. The crowd began screaming now. People shoved toward exits. Children cried. Security forces struggled desperately to contain the growing chaos, and beneath it all, emotion exploded. Fear, terror, panic, exactly what Grimm hungered for. Far beyond Vale's walls, the Grimm heard it. The first warning sirens began howling across the city. Belgarath looked sharply toward the horizon. Garion followed his gaze. Black shapes moved in the distance, thousands of them. The old sorcerer's expression hardened instantly. They're coming. The arena shook violently. Outside, Atlas airships suddenly jerked erratically in the sky. One exploded. Screams erupted across the stadium again. Ironwood stared upward in disbelief. No. Cinder's voice continued mercilessly across every screen. Today, the illusion of peace ends. Then the broadcast shifted. Images of chaos flooded every monitor. Grimm swarming toward Vale. Atlas robots turning against civilians. Panic feeding panic. The kingdom unraveling in real time. Beacon Academy alarms blared throughout the city. The Battle of Beacon had begun. Inside the shattered arena, RWBY sprinted toward the battlefield below. Pennin, Yang grabbed for her too late. Blake and Weiss followed immediately. Pyrrha still stood motionless near the remains of the android girl. Broken, horrified. Garion moved instinctively toward the arena stairs. Silk caught his arm briefly. This is going to get very ugly. Garion drew the sword of the Revan King. Blue fire ignited along the blade. I know, nearby. Belgarath stared outward toward the approaching grim tide. His ancient eyes darkened slowly. Something else is moving, he said quietly. Garion looked toward him sharply. What? Belgarath's expression became grim. Magic. And high above Beacon Academy, far beyond mortal sight, the storm finally broke. Chapter 15. Fire across Vale. Vale burned. Smoke rolled upward through the night sky while warning sirens echoed endlessly across the city. Grimm flooded through shattered streets in black waves as civilians fled in panic beneath collapsing buildings and crashing aircraft. The Battle of Beacon had become a war for survival in less than an hour. Beowulfs sprinted through marketplaces. Nevermores descended from smoke-filled skies. Massive Ursai smashed through barricades while huntsmen and huntresses fought desperately street by street, trying to hold the city together, and everywhere fear fed the Grimm further. General James Ironwood sprinted through Beacon's upper docking platforms, surrounded by smoke and chaos. Atlas soldiers shouted conflicting reports into damaged communication systems while airships spiraled uncontrollably overhead. One exploded against Beacon Tower in a shower of fire. Ironwood never slowed. My flagship, he barked into his scroll. Re-establish command authorization immediately. Static answered, then screaming, then nothing. Winter Schnee moved beside him with practiced precision, cutting down rogue Atlesian knights that turned their weapons on nearby personnel. Systems across the fleet are compromised, she warned. Ironwood's expression hardened further, exactly as Belgarath predicted. Someone had turned Atlas technology against itself. Ahead, his command cruiser remained docked against the tower platform. For one brief moment, hope returned. Then the ship's main cannons rotated toward him. Winter's eyes widened. General, the guns fired. Ironwood hurled himself sideways as explosions tore across the docking platform. Metal screamed. Soldiers vanished beneath fire and debris. The general slammed hard against the platform railing while Winter's glyphs erupted around them defensively. More Atlesian knights emerged from the flagship's interior. Their glowing eyes burned hostile red now. Not allies, enemies. Ironwood rose immediately, despite blood running down one side of his face. So that's how it is. The android soldiers opened fire. Winter launched herself forward without hesitation, while Ironwood ripped one knight apart with his mechanical arm. The flagship shuddered violently. Engines overloaded. Smoke burst from beneath its hull, and then the massive cruiser began falling directly toward Vale below. Ironwood stared downward grimly. Hundreds of civilians remained in its path. Damn it! The flagship crashed into the city moments later with catastrophic force. Fire consumed several entire blocks. Elsewhere across Vale, Belgariad stood atop the remains of a shattered transit station, while Grimm surged through the streets below. The old sorcerer raised one hand sharply. The will and the word erupted outward. A massive section of collapsed roadway ripped upward from the ground and crushed an advancing pack of Beowulfs beneath tons of broken stone. Nearby huntsmen froze briefly in shock. Belgariad ignored them. "Move the civilians east," he shouted. "Now." His voice carried with impossible force across the battlefield. People obeyed instinctively. Another Nevermore descended from the smoke-filled skies. Belgariad spoke a single word. Lightning exploded upward. The creature disintegrated instantly. Yet, even as he fought, frustration darkened his expression. There were too many enemies, too much chaos. Sorcery was powerful, but battlefields consumed power endlessly. Every spell demanded concentration, precision, will, and unlike Grimm, Belgariad was still only one man. "This," he muttered irritably while blasting apart another charging Ursa, "is why I hate wars." Nearby civilians stared openly at the old man wielding impossible power. One huntsman finally found his voice. "Sir, what are you?" Belgariad looked genuinely annoyed by the question. "Tired." Farther within the city, Garion and Silk descended from Beacon alongside Team RWBY through shattered streets filled with smoke and panic. RWBY led the charge. Crescent Rose carved through Grimm with desperate speed, while Yang's shotgun blasts echoed like artillery. Blake's shadow clones flickered through darkness, while Weiss created glyph barriers, protecting fleeing civilians. Garion fought beside them, instinctively now. The sword of the Revan King blazed blue through the night as Grimm fell before him in shattered pieces. Yet despite the chaos, he still could not fully process Penny, Pyrrha, the horror in the arena. None of them could. They simply kept moving, because stopping meant people died. A massive Beowulf lunged from atop a wrecked vehicle directly toward a trapped family. Garion moved instantly. Blue fire flashed. The Grimm vanished in two halves before it touched the ground. The civilians stared at him in shock. Garion barely noticed. "Keep moving!" he shouted. Silk fought entirely differently. The Drasnian prince moved through chaos like living misdirection itself. Knives flashed. Hidden darts struck Grimm eyes precisely. He redirected creatures into each other, collapsed debris at perfect moments, and somehow talked constantly while doing it. "I deeply resent monsters that don't value self-preservation," he complained, while narrowly avoiding claws. Yang laughed despite everything. "How are you still joking? It's either humor or screaming." "Fair point." Then gunfire erupted overhead, perfectly controlled, precise. A massive Nevermore crashed violently into the street before them. Several figures landed atop nearby rooftops immediately afterward. Team Coffee. Coco Adel adjusted her sunglasses calmly despite the apocalypse around them. "Well," she declared, "Beacon really knows how to throw a festival." RWBY brightened instantly. "Team Coffee." Velvet Scarlatina stepped nervously beside the others while carrying what appeared to be an oddly oversized camera case. More Grimm flooded into the street, dozens of them. Coco glanced toward Velvet. "You ready?" Velvet hesitated only briefly, then nodded. She opened the case. Garion blinked. Inside rested dozens of miniature weapon constructs. Velvet grabbed the device and suddenly the entire mechanism transformed in her hands into a massive, dust-powered weapon system. Ruby gasped. Oh, here we go. Velvet's ears lowered nervously. Then her aura flared brilliantly. Garion stared as holographic energy formed around the weapon. No, not one weapon, multiple, different weapons, all copied perfectly. She records fighting styles. Weiss explained quickly, while launching glyphs beneath advancing Grim. Her semblance lets her replicate them. Velvet moved, and suddenly she fought like everyone. A hammer strike with Yang's explosive force, a scythe movement mirroring Ruby, a spear thrust resembling Pyrrha. Weapon forms shifted continuously through dazzling bursts of light and dust fire. Entire waves of Grim collapsed before her. Silk stared openly. This world genuinely rewards insanity. Coco smirked while unleashing devastating minigun fire down the street. You're just figuring that out. The battle intensified around them. Smoke filled the skies. Atlas ships burned overhead. Grim howls echoed endlessly through Vale, and somewhere above it all, Cinder Fall watched Beacon Academy begin to collapse exactly as planned. Chapter 16. The Wyvern Awakens. Vale was dying. Fire spread across entire districts, while Grim flooded through shattered streets in numbers no Kingdom Defense Force could contain quickly enough. Sirens echoed endlessly beneath smoke-blackened skies as Atlas drones battled rogue machines overhead. And above all of it, Beacon Academy burned. From a rooftop overlooking the city, Cinderfall watched the chaos with quiet satisfaction. Emerald stood nearby with folded arms while Mercury leaned lazily against a ventilation unit, though even he looked unsettled by the scale of destruction below. Okay, Mercury admitted, while watching a Nevermore tear through an airship. This officially got out of hand faster than usual. Emerald glared at him. That was always the plan. Yeah, but usually I prefer plans where entire cities don't collapse. Cinder ignored them both. Her eyes remained fixed upon Beacon Tower, upon the ancient mountain across from it, waiting. At last she stepped toward the edge of the rooftop. The stolen fragment of Fall Maiden power flickered around her in crimson embers. Then she raised one hand and called. The air changed instantly. Far beyond the city center, the mountain beneath Beacon trembled, at first only slightly, then violently. Buildings shook, glass shattered. Deep beneath layers of ancient stone, something enormous moved for the first time in centuries. Emerald's expression shifted uneasily. That's new. Cinder's voice remained calm. Salem granted me a gift. A deafening roar split the night. The mountain exploded outward. Stone avalanched downward as a colossal shape emerged from the darkness beneath Beacon itself. Wings, claws, black bone armor. A Grim so massive it dwarfed nearby towers entirely. The ancient wyvern rose screaming into the burning sky. Across Vale, people froze in horror. Even Grim nearby recoiled instinctively from the creature's presence. Mercury stared upward openly now. That thing was inside the mountain. Cinder's faint smile never wavered. For a very, very long time, the wyvern soared above Beacon Tower with a howl that shook the city itself. Then black ooze began dripping from beneath its massive body. At first, slowly, then in torrents. Pools of dark corruption crashed into streets and rooftops below, and where the ooze landed, Grim emerged. Freshly born beowulves clawed their way from the black liquid. Creepers formed from writhing shadows. Winged Grim erupted from the puddles, screaming into the night. Emerald took an involuntary step backward. That's disgusting. Far below, Garion looked upward in stunned disbelief as another mass of black slime crashed into the street nearby. The ooze writhed, moved, then exploded outward into newly formed Grim. What in the seven hells is that? Yang shouted while blasting apart a charging Beowulf. Garion could barely answer. The wyvern eclipsed the burning skies above them entirely. I don't know. Beside him, Silk actually looked shaken for once. That thing is birthing Grim. Another puddle crashed nearby. More creatures emerged instantly. Velvet recoiled visibly. That's impossible. No, Belgarath's voice said grimly as the old sorcerer arrived atop broken rubble nearby. Unfortunately, it isn't. Garion turned sharply. The old man stared upward at the wyvern with ancient fury in his eyes. That creature is saturated with corruption, Belgarath said darkly. Something twisted it into a breeding source. Blake's ears flattened against her head. Can it be stopped? Belgarath remained silent for one dangerous moment. Possibly. Which meant maybe not. The wyvern screamed again overhead. More grim poured into Vale, and for the first time since arriving in remnant Garion, truly understood why humanity feared extinction. High above the battlefield, inside Beacon Tower, Ozpin stood alone in the elevator descending toward the Academy courtyard. The kingdom around him collapsed in fire and panic, yet his expression remained calm, tired, but calm. The elevator doors opened. Pyrrhanikos waited in the courtyard exactly where he expected. She looked exhausted, broken by grief over Penny, terrified by responsibility, and yet still standing. Ozpin approached quietly. Above them, the wyvern circled Beacon Tower like a herald of apocalypse. Pyrrha looked upward briefly, then back toward him. "It's time?" she whispered. Yes. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of battle, but from fear of choice. Ozpin regarded her sadly. "I wish there had been more time." Pyrrha laughed once weakly. "There never really was? Was there?" "No, there wasn't." The old headmaster looked toward Beacon Academy one final time. Towards the students fighting below, towards the kingdom already falling apart, towards the future slipping rapidly into darkness. Then he looked back at Pyrrha and gave the signal. "We need to go now." Silence lingered between them. Pyrrha closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, fear still remained, but so did resolve. She nodded once and followed Ozpin into the depths beneath Beacon Tower while the world above continued to burn. Chapter 17. The Fall Maiden. Deep beneath Beacon Academy, hidden below layers of ancient stone and atlas machinery, the vault chamber hummed with quiet power. Outside, Beacon burned. Distant tremors echoed faintly through the underground corridors while grim roars carried dimly through the earth itself. Yet, inside the chamber, everything felt strangely still. Pyrrhanikos stood beside the transfer apparatus, trying unsuccessfully to steady her breathing. At the center of the room, Amber rested within her life support pod, the dying Fall Maiden. Ozpin approached quietly. For the first time since Pyrrha had met him, the headmaster looked truly old, not physically, spiritually, as though centuries weighed upon him all at once. "You may still refuse," he said softly. Pyrrha looked toward the unconscious woman inside the pod, then upward toward the distant chaos-consuming beacon above. Students were fighting for their lives. People were dying, and somehow the fate of ancient magic had fallen into her hands. She swallowed once. "If I say no," she asked quietly, "what happens?" Ozpin's expression saddened slightly. The power would pass randomly upon Amber's death. He paused. "And our enemies would continue searching for it." Pyrrha lowered her eyes briefly. "Responsibility. Again. Always responsibility." At last, she nodded once. "Then, let's begin." Ozpin gave a solemn incline of his head and activated the transfer chamber. Golden energy slowly began flowing between Amber's pod and the machines surrounding Pyrrha. The effect was immediate. Pyrrha gasped sharply as warmth flooded through her body like liquid fire. Wind stirred violently throughout the chamber, while ancient power spiraled around her in glowing streams. The transfer had begun. Ozpin watched silently. Not triumphant, only hopeful. For a few brief moments, it almost seemed possible that they might succeed. Then the vault doors exploded inward. Fire and shattered metal tore through the chamber. Cinder Falls stepped calmly through the smoke. Ozpin's eyes narrowed. "Cinder." The young woman smiled faintly. "Ozpin." Flames danced around her fingers while the stolen fragment of Fall Maiden power shimmered visibly around her body. Pyrrha immediately understood. This was the one who attacked Amber, the one behind everything. Cinder's eyes moved toward the pod, towards the remaining maiden power. Then she raised one hand. A burning glass arrow formed instantly. Ozpin moved, too late. The arrow shot forward like lightning and pierced directly through Amber's chest. Pyrrha cried out. The dying maiden convulsed weakly, then went still. For one terrible heartbeat, silence consumed the chamber. Then the room exploded with golden light. The remaining Fall Maiden power tore free from Amber in a torrent of burning energy and rushed directly into Cinder Fire, spiraled wildly through the chamber, and the air itself shook. Cinder arched backward slightly as the full power of the Fall Maiden flooded into her soul. Then, slowly, she looked up again. Her eyes burned like embers. At last, Pyrrha's horror transformed instantly into fury. With a sharp cry, she unleashed her semblance against the transfer chamber. Metal screamed apart. The sealed pod doors ripped open violently, and Pyrrha leapt free beside Ozpin with shield and spear ready. Golden traces of interrupted maiden power still flickered faintly around her. Cinder smiled coldly. So close, Pyrrha attacked immediately. Spear and shield clashed against burning glass blades as Ozpin joined the fight beside her. Ancient magic erupted through the chamber while fire blasted across stone walls. For several moments the battle became chaos. Pyrrha fought desperately, driving Cinder backward with a storm of precise strikes while Ozpin wielded magic unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Wind exploded through the chamber. Invisible force shattered stone pillars. Cinder answered with torrents of flame and razor-sharp glass weapons conjured from thin air. The vault trembled around them. Then Ozpin suddenly stepped between them. Enough. Pyrrha looked toward him in confusion. "Professor?" The headmaster's eyes remained fixed on Cinder, but his voice softened slightly. "You must leave." "What?" "She wants the tower," Ozpin said firmly, "and the others above are already fighting grim across Beacon's courtyard." Pyrrha hesitated. Above them, Jeanne, RWBY, her friends, Garion and the others all fought. They fought for Beacon itself. Ozpin finally looked toward her directly. "Find them," he said quietly. "Help protect the tower." Pyrrha stared at him, then at Cinder. Understanding slowly dawned across her face. This was not truly her battle. Not yet. "Ozpin, there is no time." The old wizard's expression carried no fear, only certainty. Reluctantly, painfully, Pyrrha stepped backward, then turned and sprinted toward the vault exit. The doors sealed shut behind her, leaving Ozpin alone with Cinder Fall. For several seconds neither moved. Flames flickered softly through the ruined chamber. Then Cinder smiled faintly. "She was right about you." Ozpin said nothing, simply staring at Cinder with intense concentration. "Such arrogance," Cinder added, and then they each attacked. The hidden vault chamber erupted into devastation. Magic collided with magic as Ozpin unleashed power, unseen in Remnant for generations. Waves of force tore through stone while Cinder answered with blazing torrents of fire, hot enough to melt the ancient walls themselves. Ozpin moved with terrifying precision. Every motion practiced, every spell controlled, ancient mastery refined over countless lifetimes. For several moments he drove her backward. Cinder's confidence faltered slightly beneath the sheer experience of the man before her. But she possessed something Ozpin no longer did. Youth, stamina, and the overwhelming raw power of a full maiden flames surged violently through the chamber. Glass spears formed by the dozens, and the battle shook the foundations beneath Beacon Tower itself. Ozpin shattered burning projectiles with invisible force and struck Cinder with blasts powerful enough to crack entire stone pillars apart. Yet slowly, very slowly, he began to tire. Cinder saw it immediately and smiled. "You're through." Ozpin said nothing. He simply attacked again, but now the balance had shifted. Cinder's firestorm overwhelmed his defenses inch by inch, while molten glass rained through the collapsing chamber. Then finally, an opening. Cinder moved instantly. A blazing spear of glass erupted forward and pierced directly through Ozpin's chest. The chamber fell silent. Ozpin staggered once. He looked down slowly at the wound, then back toward Cinder. No hatred filled his eyes, only deep, immeasurable sadness. Cinder's breathing came harder now from exertion, but triumph burned behind her gaze. "You lose." Ozpin looked past her briefly, as though seeing something far away, something beyond Beacon, beyond Remnant itself. Then the old wizard collapsed beneath the burning vault chamber, and above them Beacon Academy continued to fall. Chapter 18. Broken Beacon Academy had become a nightmare of smoke and blood. Grim prowled through shattered courtyards, while White Fang operatives clashed with huntsmen across collapsing halls and burning streets. Atlas drones fired wildly overhead, some protecting civilians while others slaughtered them after falling under enemy control. The world had dissolved into chaos, and somewhere within it, Blake Belladonna ran, not from fear, but from recognition. The White Fang soldiers flooding Beacon wore masks she knew, moved in formations she remembered, and fought with tactics she had once trained beside. Every glimpse of them twisted painfully inside her chest. Her old life had come here, and at the center of it, him. Blake sprinted across a ruined corridor, Gambol's shroud flashing as she cut down a charging Beowulf before pivoting to avoid rifle fire from two masked White Fang operatives. "You don't have to do this," she shouted. One answered with a blade, the other with gunfire. Blake's shadow clone absorbed the attack while she vaulted through a shattered doorway into another section of the building, panting, alone. Then she felt it, a familiar presence. It was cold, controlled and terrifying. Blake froze. "No, ahead!" Deeper within the ruined structure, screams echoed. Human, faunus, metal, then silence. Blake moved instantly toward the sound. She burst into a collapsed chamber littered with debris, broken Atlesian knights and fallen defenders. At the center stood a lone figure holding a crimson blade. He had bull-shaped horns, red and black clothing, and a grim mask, stillness like restrained violence itself. Adam Taurus slowly turned toward her. For a moment, neither spoke, then Adam tilted his head slightly. Blake, her heart sank. He sounded calm, which made it worse. Around him lay both White Fang members and defenders alike. Human soldiers, robots and students, anyone who stood in his way. One wounded Beacon student struggled weakly nearby, trying to crawl backward across the floor. Adam glanced down at the student, then casually raised Wilt. Blake moved instantly. "No!" Adam blocked her strike effortlessly, with the impact jarring Blake backward immediately. His strength hadn't diminished, and if anything had grown worse. Adam sighed softly. "You left us." Blake gritted her teeth. "You became a murderer." His masked gaze settled on her. "And you abandoned me." Blake attacked again desperately. Adam dismantled her offense almost casually. Every strike countered, every movement anticipated. He moved with horrifying precision while continuing to speak calmly through the battle. "I gave you purpose." Blake's clone shattered under a crimson slash. "I gave you strength." Another strike sent Gambol's shroud spinning from her grip. "And you ran." Adam slammed her hard against a broken support pillar where pain exploded through Blake's ribs. And before she could recover, Adam grabbed her by the throat and lifted her effortlessly. "You chose them," he said quietly. Not angry, worse, disappointed. Blake struggled against his grip. "They're my friends." Adam's voice lowered dangerously. "And what was I?" The wounded student nearby tried weakly to stand again. Adam glanced toward him, then raised his blade. Blake's eyes widened. "Stop." A shotgun blast exploded through the chamber. Adam released Blake instantly and stepped backward as Yang Xiaolong charged into the room like a thunderbolt. "Get away from her!" Garion sprinted in directly behind her, the sword of the Revan King blazing blue in the smoke-filled darkness. Yang looked down at Blake, who was lying on the floor at Adam's feet. Adam regarded them silently, but with determined focus. Then his gaze settled on Yang, and with a smile, stabbed down into Blake's side. Yang's eyes burned red already, and she screamed in rage. Adam simply stood at a ready position, his hand on the blade's hilt. Blake tried to rise. Yang, don't please. It was too late. Yang attacked. Her semblance erupted fully as rage and fear amplified her strength explosively. Ember Celica roared with shotgun fire while she drove directly toward Adam with reckless fury. Adam remained perfectly calm, with his hand loosening Wilt for a quick release. Garion saw it happening instantly. Yang! Adam's crimson weapon flashed and his semblance activated. Moonslice exploded outward in a massive arc of stored kinetic energy. Yang barely had time to realize the trap before the strike passed through her. There was a horrible sound. Then silence. Yang staggered. Her right arm fell to the floor, blood splashed across broken stone. For one stunned second, nobody moved. Yang stared blankly at the empty space where her arm had been, then she collapsed. Blake's horror shattered into panic. Yang! Garion charged instantly between them as Adam advanced calmly toward the wounded huntresses. The sword of the Revan King blazed brighter. Adam swung again. Another devastating moon slice erupted outward and struck something unseen. Blue light exploded across the chamber as the orb of Aldur flared violently beneath Garion's tunic as an invisible barrier absorbed the attack entirely. Adam stopped. For the first time since Blake had entered the room, he looked surprised. Garion planted himself protectively before Yang and Blake, sword raised despite his terror. "You're not touching them again." Adam studied him carefully. The glowing sword, the impossible shield, something ancient and dangerous hidden beneath both. The Faunus warrior's eyes narrowed behind his mask. Then distant explosions shook the building. White Fang retreat signals echoed faintly outside. Adam glanced toward the noise briefly. Another time. Then he vanished into the smoke-filled corridors. Garion almost chased him, almost. Then he remembered Yang on the ground behind him. The blue fire around Garion's sword dimmed instantly as panic surged through him. Yang. Blake crawled desperately toward her partner and teammate, shaking violently. Yang's breathing came in ragged gasps, while blood spread rapidly beneath her. Garion dropped beside them immediately. He had seen battlefield wounds before, too many. But this was catastrophic. "We need help," he shouted. No answer. Outside the building, Beacon continued dying. Garion raised his voice again with everything he had. "Help." And from a building within the burning city, the orb of Aldur pulsed once more, as though awakening to the darkness, spreading across Remnant. Chapter 19. Destiny. Beacon's courtyard looked like the aftermath of a war. Smoke drifted across shattered stone, while exhausted students and huntsmen struggled to organize defensive lines around the wounded. Fires burned across nearby buildings, and distant grim cries echoed constantly through the night. Ruby Rose stumbled into the courtyard beside Weiss Schnee, both covered in soot and exhaustion. Then Ruby saw Yang, and time seemed to stop. Her sister lay unconscious against broken rubble, while several students worked frantically around her. Her severed arm had been wrapped tightly in blood-stained bandages, and though her aura had slowed the bleeding, her face remained deathly pale. Blake sat nearby, trembling silently with her knees drawn to her chest. Garion stood close beside them, both with his sword planted point first into the ground. The moment Ruby saw the empty space where Yang's arm should have been, her breath caught. No. She sprinted forward instantly. Yang. Blake looked up, eyes red from shock and guilt. Ruby dropped beside her sister. Yang still breathed, but barely. Relief and horror collided violently inside her chest. Weiss knelt nearby, visibly shaken despite trying to remain composed. "What happened?" Garion answered quietly. "Adam Taurus." Blake flinched visibly at the name. Ruby's hands clenched, but before she could speak further, Nora staggered toward them alongside Ren. Both looked utterly exhausted. Their clothing was torn, their auras dimmed nearly to nothing. "Ruby!" Nora cried desperately. Ren's usually calm expression carried open worry now. We can't find Pyrrha or Jean. Ruby looked up sharply. What? We got separated near the tower, Ren explained quickly. Then everything started collapsing and Grim flooded the courtyard. Nora shook her head frantically. We've looked everywhere. Blake's expression darkened immediately. Pyrrha! Garion noticed it then. The growing silence, the fear none of them wanted to voice. Ozpin was gone. The tower was under attack. Pyrrha had vanished, and somewhere above them Cinder still lived. Ruby slowly stood. Her exhaustion remained, her fear remained, but something else settled over her now. Resolve. I'm going to find them, she said quietly. Weiss looked toward her immediately. Ruby, and I'm bringing them back. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. Just determination. Garion stepped forward instantly. Then I'm coming with you. Weiss nodded immediately afterward. So am I. Ruby looked between them briefly, then smiled faintly despite everything. Okay, nearby, Blake lowered her eyes. I should. No, Ruby said softly but firmly. Blake looked startled. Ruby glanced toward Yang. She needs you here. Blake's expression broke slightly at that. Then she nodded silently. Ren straightened tiredly. We'll hold the courtyard. Nora forced a grin despite her exhaustion. Try not to die. Ruby managed a weak smile. No promises. Then the three of them turned toward Beacon Tower, towards the fire burning near its summit, towards destiny. Outside of Beacon Tower, Pyrrha Nikos and Jean Arc stared upward in horror. The elevator shaft suddenly erupted with fire. The lift platform shot violently upward toward the tower summit, trailing flames and shattered metal. Silence followed. Pyrrha's face went pale. Jorna understood immediately. Ozpin. Neither said the words aloud. They didn't need to. Cinder had won. The realization settled like ice inside the chamber. There was no time left. Above them, the wyvern screamed across the skies of Vale, while Grim continued flooding the city. Beacon was collapsing, and now the Fall Maiden stood at the top of the tower unopposed. Pyrrha slowly tightened her grip on Milor, and Akouo then turned towards the elevator shaft. Jean grabbed her arm immediately. Pyrrha, wait! She stopped but did not turn around. You can't fight her alone. Pyrrha closed her eyes briefly. She has the maiden power now. That's exactly why you shouldn't go. His voice cracked. Fear. Desperation. Pyrrha finally looked back toward him. For once, the invincible champion looked frightened too, but beneath that fear, acceptance. If no one goes, she whispered, then there won't be anything left. Jean shook his head fiercely. We'll go together. Pyrrha's expression softened painfully, and suddenly Jean realized something terrible. She had already made her decision. No, he whispered. Pyrrha stepped closer, slowly. Her hand touched his chest plate gently. You're a good person, Jean. Pyrrha, and you're going to become a great huntsman someday. Tears burned in Jean's eyes now. Don't do this. Pyrrha smiled sadly, then kissed him. For one brief, impossible moment, the battle, the Grim, the tower, everything disappeared. Then Pyrrha shoved him backward with her semblance. A locker ripped free from the walls instantly and slammed shut around Jean before he could react. Pyro! The locker shot violently away down an emergency launch corridor leading toward Beacon Cliff. Jean's desperate pounding echoed briefly through the chamber, then vanished. Silence returned. Pyrrha stood alone. Above her, firelight flickered down the ruined elevator shaft. The Fall Maiden waited. Pyrrha inhaled once slowly, then walked toward the shaft. Her semblance surged. Metal cables snapped taut around her spear and shield as she launched herself upward with explosive speed through the burning tower interior. Higher, past shattered floors and collapsing walls, towards the rooftop summit where Cinder Fall waited beneath the burning sky, towards the final battle. And somewhere below, Ruby Rose was already running desperately to reach her before it was too late. Chapter 20. silver eyes, the summit of Beacon Tower burned beneath a blood-red sky. Flames consumed shattered stone, while smoke spiraled endlessly upward around the ancient tower ruins, and above it all, the colossal wyvern circled like a herald of doom, its monstrous cries echoing across the ruined kingdom. And at the center of the devastation stood Nikos, bruised, bleeding, exhausted, but unbroken. Across from her stood Cinder Fall, now fully wreathed in the power of the Fall Maiden. Fire swirled around her body while molten glass weapons formed effortlessly in the air behind her. The difference in power had become impossible to ignore, yet Pyrrha still fought. Milo flashed upward in spear form as Pyrrha lunged forward with everything she had left. Her shield deflected burning arrows, while her semblance ripped shattered metal from the tower around them into a storm of razor-sharp projectiles. Cinder answered with fire. Glass exploded across the rooftop, and flames melted stone itself beneath their feet. The clash of maiden magic and huntress skill shook the remains of Beacon Tower violently. Pyrrha drove forward again and again, every strike precise, every movement desperate, because she knew as she could, felt her aura weakening, that she only had a limited amount of time. She could feel exhaustion creeping into her limbs. Cinder knew it too. The maiden smiled coldly while conjuring another wave of burning glass blades. "You're impressive," she admitted. Pyrrha blocked 2 strikes, then a third. The fourth shattered her shield entirely. The impact hurled her across the rooftop ruins. Pain exploded through her body as she slammed hard against broken stone. Her aura flickered visibly now, barely holding together. Cinder descended slowly through drifting embers. "But you were never meant to win." Pyrrha forced herself upright anyway, her spear trembling in her hands. Below them, Vale burned. Beacon was falling apart, and still Pyrrha stood. "Do you believe in destiny?" she said weakly. Cinder tilted her head slightly. Pyrrha's breathing came ragged now, and Cinder said just one word. "Yes." Another quick attack, and Pyrrha's aura shattered completely. The sound echoed like breaking glass across the rooftop. Suddenly, all the pain hit at once, every bruise, every burn, every injury. Pyrrha nearly collapsed. Cinder slowly raised one hand. Molten glass spiraled together into a burning crimson arrow. Pyrrha stared at it silently. No strength remained, no way to dodge. Below the tower, Weiss Schnee reached the collapsing structure alongside RWBY, Garion, and Joan. RWBY looked upward, desperately. Pi Arach, far above, the arrow ignited brighter. Weiss thrust Myrtenaster forward instantly. Glyphs exploded into existence along the shattered tower walls. "Go!" RWBY launched herself upward first with crescent rows, propelling her between glyph platforms in blinding bursts of speed. Garion followed immediately behind, blue fire blazing along the sword of the Revan King as Weiss's glyphs carried him skyward through collapsing debris and smoke above. Cinder released the arrow. Pyrrha closed her eyes, and RWBY burst onto the rooftop. No, too late. The glass arrow pierced directly through Pyrrha's chest. Time seemed to stop. Pyrrha gasped sharply. Blood spread across bronze armor. Her spear slipped from numb fingers. Cinder stepped forward calmly to finish it when Garion landed between them. The orb of Aldur exploded with blue light as Garion raised his sword protectively before the dying huntress. "Back off!" Cinder recoiled instinctively from the sudden surge of ancient power. For one brief moment, she truly saw the orb, saw something impossibly old staring back through it. Then RWBY saw Pyrrha fall. Something inside her shattered completely. Fear, grief, horror, all of it erupted at once. And suddenly silver light exploded from her eyes, the world vanishing beneath radiance. Cinder screamed. The blast of power tore across Beacon Tower like a wave of living moonlight. Grim throughout the city, shrieked in agony as the silver radiance expanded outward endlessly. Above the tower, the wyvern froze mid-flight. Stone rapidly spread across its monstrous body. Within seconds, the colossal Grim petrified completely against the side of Beacon Tower. Cinder staggered backward, screaming, as the silver light burned through her maiden powers and her ties to the grim like fire through paper. One side of her face blackened instantly. Her left eye ruined. The fall maiden collapsed into the tower shadows in agony. Then the light faded. Ruby fell unconscious immediately afterward, and silence followed. Smoke drifted quietly across the ruined rooftop. Garion dropped beside Pyrrha instantly. Pyrrha! Her breathing came shallow and wet now. Too much blood. The arrow wound had pierced straight through her chest. Weiss reached Ruby while Garion desperately tried to stop the bleeding. No, no, no. Then footsteps pounded up the tower stairs. Jawn, he burst onto the rooftop, gasping for breath. Then he saw her. Pyrrha! He screamed and dropped to his knees beside her instantly. Pyrrha's eyes fluttered weakly toward him. Jawn, no, he choked out. No, no, no. His hands pressed desperately against the wound. Blood soaked through instantly. Pyrrha tried weakly to smile. I'm sorry. Jawn shook violently. You're not dying. But even as he said it, he knew. Everyone knew. Pyrrha's aura was gone. Her life was slipping away, and something in Jawn broke. Not with rage, not with despair. With refusal. No, he whispered again, and something answered. Golden light suddenly flared around Jawn's body. Everyone froze, warmth spread outward from his hands into Pyrrha, not healing, amplifying, strengthening. Her remaining spark of life surged suddenly beneath his touch. Pyrrha gasped sharply. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Golden energy wrapped around both of them as Jawn's semblance finally awakened fully. Aura, amplification, life feeding life. Pyrrha's shattered body slowly began repairing itself beneath the radiant glow. Weiss stared openly. Garion blinked in disbelief. Even the orb pulsed softly in response. Pyrrha's breathing steadied, and color slowly returned to her face. And for the second time that night, a miracle occurred atop Beacon Tower. Jawn looked down at her with tears streaming openly down his face. Pyrrha stared back at him weakly. Alive, barely, but alive. And below them, Beacon still burned. But for one fragile moment amidst the ashes, hope survived. Chapter 21, The Beginning of the End. Ruby Rose awoke in a panic. She bolted upright in bed, unconsciously reaching for Crescent Rose, while pain exploded behind her eyes hard enough to nearly send her collapsing back into the pillow. Easy, easy. Strong hands caught her shoulders before she could fall. Ruby blinked wildly. Her room, patch, home, morning sunlight filtered softly through the window curtains, while the smell of ocean air drifted faintly inside. For several panicked seconds, none of it made sense. Then memory crashed into her all at once. Beacon, Pyrrha, Cinder, the silver light. Ruby gasped sharply. Her father, Taiyang Xiaolong, held her carefully while trying unsuccessfully to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. You're okay, he said softly. You're safe. Safe. The word felt wrong. Ruby looked around quickly. Seated nearby were Crow, Branwen, and Belgarath. The old sorcerer sat near the window with his arms folded, while Crow leaned silently against the far wall, nursing a cup of coffee that smelled significantly stronger than coffee. Ruby's breathing came fast. What happened? She asked immediately. Beacon, Pyrrha, Yang. Slow down, kid, Crow said quietly. Ruby looked at him desperately. How long was I out? 2 days, Tai answered gently. Ruby froze. 2. The battle replayed in fragments behind her eyes. Pyrrha falling, the wyvern Cinder screaming. Then only white light. Her head throbbed violently again. Tai carefully steadied her. You pushed yourself hard. Ruby looked toward him quickly. Yang. Tai hesitated, only for a second, but Ruby saw it, and fear returned instantly. She's alive, he said carefully. She's going to be all right. The hesitation hurt more than the words. Ruby's voice became very small. Her arm, Tai lowered his eyes briefly. Yes. Silence filled the room. Ruby stared down at the blanket clenched tightly in her hands. Beacon had fallen. Yang was broken. Pyrrha had nearly died. and somehow the world had continued moving anyway. Crow finally pushed himself away from the wall. "Tai," he said quietly, "mind giving us a minute?" Tai nodded reluctantly. "Sure." He squeezed Ruby's shoulder gently before heading toward the door. "I'll check on Yang. Maybe make some tea." The door shut softly behind him. Silence lingered briefly. Then Belgarath spoke. "I'm staying." Crow sighed heavily. "Figured." The old sorcerer looked entirely unapologetic. "You're about to discuss ancient magical secrets and curses. I'm interested." Crow rubbed one hand over his face. "Gods, Ozpin, must have hated you." "Probably," Belgarath agreed. Ruby looked between them in confusion. "What's going on?" Crow studied her carefully, then asked quietly. "What do you remember?" Ruby frowned. "I remember Pyrrha." Her voice faltered slightly. "Then Cinder." Then she pressed one hand against her forehead. "White light." She looked up again. "And my head hurt." Crow nodded slowly. "Yeah." Belgarath's eyes narrowed slightly. "So it's true." Ruby blinked. "What is?" Crow exhaled slowly, then sat down across from her. "Ruby, your eyes aren't normal." Ruby stared at him blankly. "What? Your silver eyes," said Crow. Belgarath leaned forward slightly with sudden interest. Crow continued carefully. "There used to be warriors long ago who carried them. People who could destroy Grimm with a glance." He paused. "Most folks think they're just legends now." Ruby slowly touched beneath one eye, unconsciously. "The light came from you," Crow confirmed. Belgarath frowned thoughtfully. "Interesting." Crow glanced toward him. "That's one word for it." The old sorcerer rubbed his beard slowly. "In my world," he said thoughtfully, "certain bloodlines carried gifts tied directly to higher powers or cosmic forces." His gaze shifted toward Ruby. "This feels similar." Ruby looked deeply uncomfortable with the entire conversation. "So I'm magic?" Crow barked a short laugh. "You could say that, but rather you have magic." "There's a difference, I think." Then Belgarath's expression darkened slightly. "Ozpin knew about this, didn't he?" Crow's amusement vanished immediately. "Yes. And now Ozpin is dead." Silence settled heavily across the room. Then Belgarath asked the question quietly. He had a contingency plan. It wasn't phrased as a question. Crow looked tired suddenly, older than before. "Yeah." Ruby frowned. "What do you mean?" Crow hesitated. For several long seconds he seemed to debate internally whether to speak. Then finally, "Ozpin can't really die." Ruby stared, and Belgarath's eyes narrowed sharply. Crow leaned back heavily. "Long story short, the gods cursed him a long, long time ago." His expression darkened. "Every time he dies, his soul reincarnates into someone else." Ruby blinked. "That's possible." Belgarath snorted softly. "Unfortunately," Crow nodded grimly. "He comes back eventually. Always has." Ruby tried processing that. Failed. "So Ozpin is somewhere." "Probably," Crow admitted. "We just don't know where yet." Belgarath looked toward the window thoughtfully. "An immortal enemy, endless reincarnations." He sighed softly. "This world is becoming annoyingly familiar." Ruby looked up quickly. "What do you mean?" The room became very still for a while. Belgarath simply said, to make the story short, as Crow himself just said, "In my world, a certain event has occurred over and over and over for thousands of years. The actual events and outcomes may change a little bit, but in the end, when one cycle is done, it begins again, where it heads towards another confrontation. In my world," Belgarath said, "it's known as the confrontations between the Child of Light and the Child of Dark. Each appointed champion is different each time, but the confrontations stay the same." Crow stood slowly. "Yeah, well, it sounds like you do understand what's at stake." Belgarath grunted. Ruby wanted to ask more, but she needed Yang first. Yang's room was dark, with all the curtains closed and lights turned off. Ruby stepped inside quietly. Yang sat on the bed, staring toward the wall, her missing arm hidden beneath blankets. She didn't look up immediately, then finally said, "Hey, Ruby's." Ruby's throat tightened as she ran to give her sister a hug. Ruby then sat carefully beside her, with neither speaking for several moments. Finally, Ruby whispered, "I'm sorry." Yang laughed once softly, but not happily. "For what?" Ruby looked down. "For everything." Yang finally turned slightly toward her. "You didn't cut my arm off. No emotion. No anger. That frightened Ruby more." "What happened to everyone?" Ruby asked quietly. Yang stared toward the wall again. "Weiss's dad came and took her back to Atlas." Ruby frowned immediately. "What?" Yang shrugged weakly. "Didn't really ask her opinion. He just arrived and took her back to Atlas." "And Blake?" This time, Yang's expression tightened slightly. "She left." Ruby blinked. "Left." Yang nodded once. As soon as she could walk properly, silence followed. Ruby felt something cold settle in her chest. Team Ruby had shattered almost overnight, and Beacon was gone. Everything was changing, and Yang no longer seemed to care. Months passed slowly on patch. The world mourned Beacon. Kingdoms tightened borders. Fear spread. Rumors spread faster. Yet eventually, movement returned. Ruby stood quietly beneath the night sky near Patch's eastern shoreline, where several familiar figures waited beside packed supplies and weapons. Team Juniper. Jorna adjusted his shield straps nervously, while Nora bounced impatiently beside Ren and Pyrrha. They both stood silently beneath the moonlight, alive, still healing, but alive. "We're heading to Mistral," Jorn explained quietly. "Haven Academy." Ruby nodded. "I know." Pyrrha studied her carefully. "You're certain about this?" Ruby looked eastward, towards the unknown, towards answers, towards whatever came next. "No," she admitted, then smiled faintly. "But I'm going anyway." "Well," Silk said from nearby, "that sounds appropriately reckless." Ruby turned. Belgarath approached slowly beside Garion and Silk. The old sorcerer looked profoundly unimpressed by nighttime travel. "We've decided to accompany you," Belgarath said simply. Garion nodded. "We still need answers about this world." His hand rested lightly against the orb beneath his cloak. "And maybe a way home eventually." Silk grinned faintly. "Besides, traveling with emotionally traumatized teenagers into dangerous territory appears to be our destiny now." Pyrrha actually laughed softly at that. Then another voice spoke from behind them. "You kids weren't honestly thinking I'd let you wander into Mistral alone, right?" Crow stepped from the darkness, carrying his sword over one shoulder. Ruby smiled immediately. "Uncle Crow," he sighed dramatically, "I hate every part of this plan already." Together, the small group turned eastward beneath the moonlight, towards Mistral, towards Haven, towards the next chapter of a broken world, and far away beyond the kingdoms of mankind, deep within the black wastelands of the Dark Domain, Salem stood alone. Ancient Grim moved silently beneath shattered skies, while pools of darkness churned endlessly around ruined stone spires. The immortal queen gazed southward, towards Vale, towards Beacon's ashes, and smiled. "This is the beginning of the end, Ozpin." She whispered softly into the darkness. Her crimson eyes gleamed with terrible satisfaction. "And I can't wait to watch you burn." This is the end of Part 1. We will bring Part 2 in the near future, where Team RWBY must deal with the outcome of their traumas, and Belgarath, Garion, and Silk learn more about the fight they never asked to be a part of, but would never let down those that needed their help.